Hello and welcome to this review of Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon. I am very lucky to be joined again on this channel by John D. Hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing reasonably well, and I'm very happy and always pleased to appear on your channel.
Fantastic. So this is the story, the film of an Irish rogue who comes to his fortune, loses it all, and ultimately comes to the point of nearly losing his life. I'd like to ask you, Dee, first, what's your relationship with this film, and very briefly, what's your sort of your view on it?
Well, my relationship, of course, is that Kubrick is one of my favorite film directors, certainly right up there of all time. So I was acquainted with his films and watched most of them quite early in my life. Had the opportunity to see some of them in the cinema as well, including this one, which is certainly recommended if you ever get the chance, because quite a lot of the appeal of this film for me is, the visual presentation and some of the visual ideas. In fact, I think that sort of part of Kubrick's the way he thought about this film, and it's something I'm sure will come up later, is as an analog or a sort of conversation with painting, with 18th century painting, and particularly ideas of depiction of characters and certain types of painting and serial painting that became quite popular in the 18th century, associated with artists such as William Hogarth. But also just generally, of course, Kubrick always had quite a visual fascination, and also with the idea of how you could innovate technically with with the medium of cinema. So, and also, I'm a painter and uh, an artist of uh, long standing. So again, it is this connection and the sort of lush and amazing visuals of this film that have always attracted me. So and also, I think that Kubrick deals with certain themes that appear in this film that appear in other works. Themes to do with power and identity, and the relationship between a kind of character and uh, you know his own sense of what he is and who he is. And that's something also I think we can talk about later as we get into the substance of the film. So, yeah, briefly, that's my sort of relationship with this, and it remains, one of my three favorite films of in Kubrick's body of work.
Indeed, and I'm approaching this from an appreciation of the artistic angle, but again, looking at this almost as an attempt to gauge a microcosm of life and culture in the 18th century. And in that vein, this is an adaptation. It's an adaptation of William Makepeace Thackeray's memoirs of Barry Lyndon, also known as the Luck of Barry Lyndon. But I'm almost inclined to say it's as much an adaptation of Thackeray's Barry Lyndon as it is an adaptation, a cinematic adaptation of the Rake's Progress. You mentioned William Hogarth, or the Marriage a la Mode, these serialized paintings. As for the sort of production history of this, of course, in 1962, Stanley Kubrick releases Clockwork Orange. In 64, this is carried on with Doctor Strangelove. In 1968, we have 2001, A Space Odyssey. But in 1970, he had planned to release a biopic about Napoleon. And one of the reasons why this didn't go ahead is that in that year, Sergei Bondarchuk released his Waterloo film, which is a very good film. I'd recommend it for anyone who's interested in military history. And what's that actor? Not Marlon Brando, Rod Steiner, has a very, from my point of view, compelling portrayal of Napoleon, which is very, very hard to amass. Certainly one that completely failed when it came to Joaquin Phoenix's disastrous miscasting in the recent Ridley Scott film. So we have that biopic. We don't have the Stanley Kubrick, alas. But I think in many ways it's probably a blessing, because I don't think it's actually possible to make a film biopic about Napoleon, even though I have an entire stream suggested to about 4 ideas on the topic. So as for this, he did a huge amount of research, Stanley Kubrick, a huge amount of research into the period of the late 18th and early 19th century for his Napoleon film that never went anywhere. And afterwards, he gravitated towards Vanity Fair, which is perhaps the better known of the Thackeray novels. Indeed, there was a miniseries published at that time, and there's since been a film, I believe, starring Reese Witherspoon, that was set in Bath. So that has also been done. But the whole sort of multi-cast of characters, and Thackeray, obviously, in Vanity Fair, you have Becky Sharp as you could almost say the equivalent of Barry Lyndon, but nevertheless, the focus on Barry Lyndon allowed for Stanley Kubrick to have a linear story focused on a pivotal character from which you can say to hang his various artistic vignettes throughout his work. In terms of like comparing this to anything at the time, the other sort of director that really came to mind is Luchino Visconti, who deals with many of the similar themes that come across in Barry Lyndon, with a rather sort of similar style. But nevertheless, he will then go on, Stanley Kubrick, to release The Shining, which is one of the most famous films of all time, and other complete sort of hodgepodge of interest, such as Full Metal Jacket. And I think in terms of all those films that I've listed, I would almost say Barry Lyndon is the most obscure of all of those films, because it was not well received at release. And this is sort of an interesting point of view to come back to the work essentially as a series of portraits or works of art, rather than the conventional sort of narrative story or film, which has sort of been the main contention that people have with it. And this comes to the issue of adaptation, because I reread the book, Thackeray's The Luck of Barry Lyndon, in order to get into this, and I was struck by a series of major differences between the source material and the film we ultimately got to see, despite the fact that all the dialogue is virtually very faithfully recreated. It all has some sort of origin within the book, but in terms of the framing of it and in terms of the whole overall framing device, it's a very different story that comes across in Kubrick. So I was wondering, okay, well, what was Stanley Kubrick's intention? And I was reading through some of his interviews about the film, and this was a particular interview given by Kubrick to Michel Clement, the French art critic. The artistic process you go through in making a film is as much a matter of discovery as it is the execution of a plan. Your first responsibility in writing a screenplay is to pay the closest possible attention to the author's ideas and make sure you really understand what he has written and why he has written it. So from the outset, there is this intention by Kubrick to try and portray the story of Barry Lyndon ostensibly to be as close to the original in terms of Thackeray's intention as possible. But then again, in a different interview, he says something very revealing, which is there is nothing of literary interest to be read in a screenplay. And he then goes on to say, the more completely cinematic a film, the less interesting it becomes as a screenplay. So it was almost as if these two ideas have a fundamental contradiction in terms of the adaptation fundamentally changing the genre to the point of view it becomes far less interesting as a literary work, to the point that something is intrinsically lost, you can say, translated as a result of that. And I think a lot of people had contentions with that at the time when it was released back in 1975. And this was one particular segment of a positive review, which later forms the basis of an article called The Perception of History in Barry Lyndon by William Stevenson. And bear in mind, again, this is the preface to a positive review. The film presents formidable obstacles to enjoyment by the viewer. A lethargic pace, a use of camera which forbids intimacy with the characters, a cold, terse style of dialogue, and an overall emotional barrenness in the storytelling, which is in strong contrast to the film's visual splendor and compelling use of the musical background. And then he'll go on to say in his argument, that the film essentially represents what I was alluding to earlier, which is in many ways a attempt at forming a microcosm of society of England and Ireland and Europe in the 18th century. And this was again another accusation that many of the actors were nothing more than pin-ups for these gorgeous artistic shots. And one of the artists which Kubrick directly references is Thomas Gainsborough, among others, which we'll get into. And I came across this little segment reading about Gainsborough a long time ago, but it rang very true in terms of, you can say, the futility of trying to superimpose actors and make them the work of art. And among the many sort of sources, this is taken from William Leakey's England of the 18th Century, and occasionally I'll add little spatters of Will and Ariel Durant's The Story of Civilization. And this is a little anecdote about Thomas Gainsborough. His sitters found him, Gainsborough, very hard to please. One lord put on all his airs as he posed. Gainsborough sent him away unpainted. David Garrick, who was a very famous Shakespearean actor in the 18th century, his features were so mobile and changeable, but this was half the secret of his superiority as an actor, that the artist could find no expression that lasted long enough to reveal the man. He had the same trouble with Garrick's rival, Samuel Foote. Rot them for a couple of rogues, they had everybody's face but their own. So again, if we're going to look at this as a exhibition of visual splendor in terms of what the actors' faces are going to reveal, and that was very much Stanley Kubrick's intention. Reading that little passage from Gainsborough seemed to undo the entire premise of trying to make that the substance of your work as a visual feast. But before I get into the most important point of adaptation, which is, I believe, the framing device, what would you have to say, Dee, about the general sort of criticism which has been directed towards the film?
Well, it's difficult for me to see because I see my way of thinking about things, certainly cinema, well, everything is sort of informed by I mean, perhaps the whole reason that I sort of became interested in art and painting and such in particular is because I just have this particular sort of view of the world, and I tend not to think about things narratively. I tend to think about things visually, and so for me, I don't, when I watch any film, certainly this one, I am thinking about less the sort of, as you said, the identity of the actors or the kind of contribution of the actors. I mean, for me, it's the same when I'm looking at a portrait. When I look at a portrait of Gainsborough, the first thing I'm thinking about is not the character or the kind of biography of the person depicted. I am looking at, of course, the painting as a painting. I'm looking at the elements of the picture, the brushwork, the color, the framing, the setting, aspects of the facture of the of the painting, rather than the kind of character of the person involved. Of course, that will enter into it at some point, but of course, I'm not. That is not what I respond to first. It's just my nature. So I I didn't even sort of. I tend not to read criticism of films, certainly before I see them. So I wasn't aware of the kind of various reactions, and indeed other people's reactions to this film. I saw it many years after it had been initially released. So, as I said, I was not immersed in kind of reactions to it at the time. So it was really until subsequently that I was exposed to these ideas that people found it slow, or that people found it, insufficiently sort of representative narrative. Indeed, I had not read Thackeray's book until after I'd seen the film. So it's difficult for me to kind of place myself in that sort of the position of that type of criticism of this film. I think of another director film director who had a lot of similarities to Kubrick, who is Alfred Hitchcock. And again, Hitchcock was tended to view actors as an element of the production, and so of course, along with all the other elements, in other words, the camera was there to shoot the totality of the production. It was the actors, it was the lighting, it was the makeup, it was the props, it was the the cinematography, whatever. I mean, all of the elements were just as important to create the motion picture. The motion picture was not just a recording device for the actors' performances or the kind of narrative that they conveyed. Indeed, of course, he did not. If you like Kubrick, you didn't improvise on the set. That the actors' sort of quote input into the character of the story was not something that neither Kubrick or Hitchcock were particularly interested in. It was part of a total work. Can't remember the Wagnerian term for total theater, but
Total Gesamtwerk or something like that.
yeah,
The total work of art.
yeah, indeed. And so this tends to be how I view how I view any film that I see, which is why I find so many I find so many movies uninteresting, because of course a lot of directors are not making films with these considerations. So I tend to be very selective about type of artists, cinema artists. So yeah, for me it's difficult. I mean, I understand perhaps the intention of this sort of criticism, but it is not really enter into my vision until I someone puts that opinion there.
Well, yes, I mean, that was actually my first impression in terms of trying to contrast this with the book, is looking at it as the Gesamtkunstwerk versus the novel. But then again, I think you're focusing again on the art and the imagery, and we were talking about that distinction between story and character. And I think I was quite frankly shocked in terms of contrasting them both, how Ryan O'Neill's Barry Lyndon is almost a completely different character. He's almost an archetype for again a certain figure, the sort of the rogue, the rake of the 18th century, more so than he has sort of particular again a genealogy, a history, a want. And this is because the book is a memoir. It's a fictional memoir. It relies on the trope of the unreliable narrator. It's actually inspired by Casanova and his Histoire de ma vie, the life history of Giacomo Casanova, the great Venetian adventurer. And of course, one of Casanova's pseudonyms as an aristocrat was a Chevalier Single, which of course is going to have a little allusion to Kubrick and Thackeray's works going on. Of course, he was involved in gambling, grand tours, prison escapes. He actually tried to present himself as an alchemist, discovering the Philosopher's Stone. He was expelled from Poland following a pistol duel involving one Polish Colonel Branicki over an Italian mistress. So many deliberate elements were taken for Thackeray and used by Casanova, but that particular aspect about the memoir, the unreliable narrator, comes forward in terms of the deliberate association by Thackeray to Casanova and Barry Lyndon. And therefore, you have an entirely different perception of the character in terms of all of his thoughts and ambitions and delusions, in many cases, self-justification, that motivate his character, to the point I would almost say that, again, it's almost helped in the way that it's framed as a memoir. There is no character arc for Barry Lyndon. He basically remains the same character from the moment where he's forced out of his sort of Irish idyll after his failed love affair and his farce of a duel, to the character he remains in debtor's prison at the end. In fact, the end of the character in the book is far more tragic in many ways than the end of the character in the film. So I was curious again, what were Stanley Kubrick's thoughts about this? And in an interview, he said this: Thackeray used the imperfect observer, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say the dishonest observer, thus allowing the reader to judge for himself with little difficulty the probable truth in Redmond Barry's view of his life. This technique worked extremely well in the novel, but of course in a film, you have objective reality in front of you all the time. So the effect of Thackeray's first-person storyteller could not be repeated on screen. And again, I find that very controversial in the sense that you can't have like a Richard III moment, breaking the third wall and breaking the fourth wall, sorry, and explaining to the audience basically his motivations, because it's been done before and it's been done since. So I don't agree with him there that it simply can't be repeated on the screen. It might have worked as a comedy by the juxtaposition of Barry's version of the truth with the reality on the screen. But I don't think that Barry Lyndon should have been done as a comedy. And again, after reading Barry Lyndon, I don't see how you can read it as a comedy. I mean, you can do anything as a comedy. There's an amount of interpretation and creativity that you can take everything and exaggerate it to an extreme and therefore make it into a comedy. But I don't read Barry Lyndon and take it as a comedy. I, again, look at it as a very deeply disturbing work in terms of the potential humor and juxtaposition you can elicit there. So again, I think there was an angle where you could have left an element of Barry's character and not, again, try to remove that, as Stanley Kubrick believed it was incumbent on him to do so. And again, he goes on to say further, I don't think that the lack of introspective dialogue scenes are any loss to the story. And again, that I believe is very controversial. Barry's feelings are there to be seen as he reacts to the increasingly difficult circumstance of his life. And again, he'll go on to reference silent film in terms of the imagery, in terms of the cinematic painting being able to communicate all the thoughts, which again would make a screenplay so distinct from a work of literary fiction. But again, I do believe that a balance can be drawn. But in the case of Kubrick, again, his intention was almost to depict all of these things visually without communicating the ideas from Barry Lyndon verbally. I think this is equally true for any of the other characters in the story. In any event, scenes of people talking about themselves are often very dull. So that was Stanley Kubrick's justification, essentially, from removing the framing device and instead having Michael Hordern act as this omniscient narrator and again, somewhat as a sort of moral judge on Barry Lyndon's character, and trying to say, for example, you can say the most sort of intervention he has is when he's talking about his love affair with a German woman during the period of his desertion, etc., where we have the narrator sort of inflecting a bit of, again, assessment or sympathy on the character, but nevertheless, the entire framing of the story is fundamentally changed as a result of that. And I was trying to think of, is there anything sort of contemporary to this which tried something different? And have you watched the Richard Burton 1983 Wagner series?
I have not. No.
No, it's beautiful. It has this again, and Salty comes out and composed, all the music for it. Rather conducted all the music for it. Has an all-star cast, from Sir John Gielgud to Vanessa Redgrave. It's 10 hours long. It starts from his exile in Dresden and to height of Bayreuth and his Venetian sort of pseudo exile. And the way that again that miniseries was managed is that you have the various elements of Wagner breaking the fourth wall and narrating aspects of his own life. And you also have a narrator on top of that who's again a real person within the story. He's one of sort of Wagner's admirers from Dresden. So there are methods again in which you can sort of take the unreliable narrator and juxtapose him with the sort of more objective narrator character. But I think in terms of how this is going to really be borne out in terms of the implications of this decision to fundamentally change the whole framing of the story, is going to come out when we talk about the individual scenes. But what really does come through, from my point of view, in terms of the adaptation, is something which I thought was moderately insightful. Then I went around and read some reviews of this and found out that someone else had already come to the exact same conclusion, as is often the case, and referred to it with a rather sort of poetical understanding of Barry Lyndon as an elegy for an age. When you read the justifications of Barry Lyndon from his own thoughts from the book, there is a huge amount of nostalgia and love lost again for a period of time which was, the height of the sort of the gentleman the aristocrat in the 1760s and the 1770s, late sort of Louis Quinze era, the sort of early Georgian period, George III period. And written again from the perspective of someone in prison in 1814, so just before the Battle of Waterloo. All of this is basically say that the French Revolution and the American Revolution have destroyed everything. There's even an allusion in the film that we are all equal now, that this whole aristocratic lifestyle that would again entrance someone like a Casanova has been completely lost, never to repeat itself. And indeed, it's something that came across when you and I discussed Talleyrand, which is the idea that Talleyrand again was the exhibition of an archetype, the archetype of the sort of French aristocrat of society in the 1780s, reading Voltaire and Rousseau and being very enamored of, enlightened despotism, and this idea that it's incumbent on the aristocracy to be learned and to, lead by example, yet also get involved in horrific acts of debauchery and contradiction in every manner possible. And so looking at someone like a Talleyrand, again, there's a interesting comparison in the sense that regardless of how much of a rogue and a rake Barry Lyndon is presented within the story, he's actually very much a reactionary. He regards himself as an establishment figure. You can almost say like a high Tory towards the end of the book, trying to preserve that that aspect, you can say, of of noble privileges, which is going to be lost. And if you're going to look at the story in terms of the beauty with which it tries to represent all of its scenes, its various, castings from Potsdam to Hohenzollern Castle to Castle Howard in Yorkshire to its idyllic scenes in Ireland. All of these elements, I think, are there to really heighten that aspect, which is so apparent within the story, which is this elegy for an age that has been lost, that the 1760s and the 1770s. Again, I'm being very conscious that I've been speaking for a very long time. So, Dee, what are your sort of thoughts on the framing device and the perils of adaptation?
Well, certainly the final title card of the film, as you alluded to, I can't remember word for word, rich or poor, they're all equal now. And of course, I think the sardonic implication, of course, of equality, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, of course, the fact that there's a sort of dual meaning, we're all equal now, but also recalls the idea that Christianity, that we are all equal in death. And that judgment will come to all, great and small, and I think that in a way is, of course, this certainly this idea of a historical, a costume drama or historical drama, is that we're kind of watching the concerns of the dead. We're watching. As you say, there's a tremendous sort of nostalgia. Even in the film, like Kubrick was, I think, quite enamored of ideas of this period. You say the early Georgian period. You even get a little sort of allusion to the later 18th century at the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey, when the astronaut Dave finds himself in that sort of room that's decorated in French period style. So I think that certainly the elegiac quality of this film, and again, just wandering through a portrait gallery or museum and looking at the sort of visages of the great personages of the past, there's an inherent sort of elegiac quality and a sort of disconnect. You're looking at a kind of an entire world that has vanished, a world of concerns which, and so many of the events in the film, when sort of viewed through that lens, I use that as slightly as a joke, because there's another aspect of this film I want to talk about later, which is how it was photographed. But to view this sort of story through that lens, a lot of the things that happen in the film sort of take on this kind of ultimately trivial and futile quality, when viewed through through the great kind of merciless machine of history, rolling over everything as it passes away. And there's even there's even sort of allusions to that. There's a battle scene which happens early in the film, and the narrator says something like, although not recorded in any history books, it was memorable enough for the people who were there. But of course, the people who were there, many of them passed out of human memory on that day, as we saw as the battle, sort of commences on the screen. But again, all of these people that we've been sort of watching their lives, watching the vicissitudes of their lives, of course, they're all gone away. So I'm always struck by that. The other thing, regards to Barry Lyndon's or Redmond Barry's character in the film, is that for me, this film is, I think of it in relation to Kubrick's final film, which is called Eyes Wide Shut, in that they're both a kind of peregrinations of a character who is in some ways an imposter. The character that Tom Cruise plays in Eyes Wide Shut, who's called Dr. Harford, which is sort of a ruthless choice for Kubrick to name him that, because when Kubrick started to develop the film that would become Eyes Wide Shut, he wanted to have Harrison Ford play the lead, but it took so long in development that Harrison Ford was too old to play the character, and so Kubrick just named the character Harford as a kind of remembrance of the fact that, that he originally wanted another actor. So sort of a double blow. But there's a sort of something for me running through Barry Lyndon, that where Redmond Barry, I mean, he is Ryan O'Neal, an American actor, sort of in the clothing of the 18th century, playing an Irish, man elevated beyond his abilities and beyond his station. And of course, but that's also what I think the character Redmond Barry is. I mean, there's just this sense that he's walking through a world which he does not really understand, and that he has no real connections. And of course, that certain people, just like in Eyes Wide Shut, certain people immediately suss this out. They can tell that he's a rogue, a rake, an imposter. Again, a person above his station. And so this element of being a kind of alien in the situation one finds oneself in. I mean, that's very, I think, something that I think about this film. I think it's a very important part of this film. And then there's, of course, a whole other thing that we probably won't get into, which is that I think Kubrick, at one point, there's an analogy towards, there's an analogy even with Kubrick, that Kubrick alluded to the idea that, of course, the experience of Jews in, European or Christian society was similarly, the kind of experience of the eternal outsider. And I think this is something that Kubrick sort of wrestled with his own sort of identity. I mean, he's also an outsider in that he lived most of his life in England. He went there to produce 2001 and never left. So, and lived a sort of life in an estate like a sort of baronial lord. But again, I think these are elements of perhaps what he was thinking about, or what he was trying to do with this film.
But just on that note, before I forget about it, there are many Jewish characters within the book, but none appear in the film, interesting enough. In fact, the entire religious element is something that we can get into, is very, very subdued.
Mm.
And again, it was a major issue, not just within the book, but of course, historically. As this is my channel, and I always review things with the idea of sort of looking at films and books as an idea of interpreting history. I already mentioned Casanova as one of the principal inspirations, and indeed the whole inspiration behind the framing device of Raymond Barry. There was also Sir Charles Hanbury Williams, who in the early 18th century was part of the Duke of Marlborough, then Duke of Marlborough circle, an ambassador to Dresden, a lover of the would-be Catherine the Great of Russia, married to a heiress, Earl Coningsby, and then died in a state of insanity in 1759. But the closer example, if you're almost going to take Casanova and combine him with someone else, is a notorious figure in late 18th century social life in England, which is Andrew Robinson's Stony Bows, whose story was according to legend, told to Thackeray directly by his grandson, John Bowes. The story is that Stoney married one widow, Countess Strathmore, after having received a promise from her while he had pretended to be mortally wounded from a duel which was ostensibly fought in her honour. He would then go on to imprison the Countess, trick her into a prenuptial agreement which gave him financial control over her estate, would apparently rape the maids and fathered many illegitimate offspring. And when finally the Countess Strathmore attempted divorce proceedings, Stoney abducted her during the trial, which led to basically a nationwide manhunt and ultimately his arrest. So you take the fiction, and then you take the story of Stoney Bowes, and again, that's the inspiration behind Barry Lyndon, the name there. And combine it to Casanova, and the real life is actually more sort of surreal than the fictional Betrayal here. But just in terms of establishing a little bit of flavor before I get into finally talking about the plot of the story, I referenced earlier that I'll be reading some segments from Leakey and Durant, and this in particular is a short segment about Durant and English morals as you found them in English society post 1756. In every society, said Adam Smith, where the distinction of ranks has once been completely established, there have always been two different schemes of systems and morality current at the same time, of which any one be called the strict or austere, the other, the liberal, or if you will, the loose system. The former is generally admired and revered by the common people, the latter more esteemed and adopted by what are called the people of fashion. And again, if that's going to be some sort of a mission statement for the film, Barry Lyndon is one of these people of fashion. John Wesley, who belonged to the austere class, described English morality in 1757 as a medley of smuggling, false oaths, political corruption, drunkenness, gambling, cheating in business, chicanery in the courts, civility in the clergy, worldliness among Quakers, and private embezzlement of charitable funds. It is an old refrain. The poor fought one another with fists and cudgels, the rich with pistols and swords. Dueling was a point of honour in the nobility. Fox, Charles Fox, one of the great orators of the late 18th century, fought Adam. Shelbourne fought Fullerton. Pitt the Younger fought Tierney. It was difficult to get through a titled life without at least one puncture. Many stories attest the sang-froid of British gentlemen in these encounters. Lord Shelbourne, having received a wound in the groin, assured his anxious seconds, "I don't think the Lady Shelbourne will be any of the worse for it." So again, if there's going to be a very short and succinct description of the frivolity of what it means to be fashionable in the 18th century, it's sort of summarized there. When we get on to sort of the idyll in Ireland, you're introduced to Ryan O'Neill's Redmond Barry with his first courtship. Again, it's quite a controversial decision in many ways to start the story here, because so many of the flashbacks and allusions to him when he was much younger, this is him sort of between 15 and 17, going off to his fight, all of that is sort of lost, and I think it leads to a few sort of story issues, sort of going down the road a bit. But nevertheless, I think what is very much intended to be captured here is that, unlike in the story, where Redmond Barry is, as with the film, he is the victim of the fact that his father had died in a duel when he was very young, and his mother, Lady Barry, the quote-unquote English widow that you see in the book, due to the fact that she basically compelled her husband to convert to Anglicanism, a major plot point in the book and something that informs the relationship later on with the Chevalier and Redmond Barry, but it doesn't come across at all in the film, interestingly enough. Again, perhaps the view of the secularized Jew trying to interpret a sort of vista of the 18th century, omitting the very important religious underpinnings to all of it. And in terms of the advantages that could be conferred upon religion within Ireland, which is such an important facet in terms of the Catholic underclass and the Anglo-Protestant nobility that lords over the Irish. Indeed, if you're going to look at the upbringing, which is this tiny little cottage in rural Ireland, you would get the impression essentially that what does it mean to be a gentleman, to be sort of dirt poor within that period? Well, for a bit of social context and history, everyone listening, to be a gentleman within Anglo-Irish and broader sort of British society at that time was actually very rare. Of a population in the British Isles of about 13 million, including Ireland, there were only roughly about 200 peerages compared to what would happen later on in the horrors regarding aristocracy in the 20th century, and only 20,000 men who could claim to be the rank of gentleman. These were sort of below a baronet who could claim the sort of hereditary rank of being bestowed the title of, or epithet of Sir. So being a gentleman actually came with all of these, you can say, haughty expectations due to the fact there were fewer gentlemen in England than there were aristocrats within France. There are around 500,000 aristocrats within France, but there are only around 20,000 gentlemen within the British Isles. And for someone like Redmond Barry, from the book, again, you don't get this impression at all within the film. He is a megalomaniac. He believes that he is descended from the Irish kings. In particular, he believes he's descended from Brian Boru. And that's later why he will name his son Brian in honor of the king. Again, he's ostensibly related from. There's this wonderful little anecdote later on in the book where he's talking to a Protestant candidate to be a pastor in Saxony. And he says, I'm related to the great stock of Irish kings, and our family can claim to be, of greater nobility than any other in Europe, etc., etc. And he says this many, many times in the book. And then the candidate simply asks him, okay, which Irish nobility are you related to? And the completely blank face. He wasn't even aware of the sort of history of Ireland where there were many kings. So you have that, and then you have this character who you don't get that impression at all from Brian O'Neill's Barry Lyndon to begin with. You have this very picturesque scene of him with Honoria or Nora Brady, the cousins of the Barry estate, and they're at play, as the aristocrats would say. They're at the table, they're gambling. And she very deliberately leads him on. She's a flirt and a floozy and a flake and all of these different things. And many people will say worse things about her. But I was thinking, because again, you were talking about the art of this scene, Dee, and forgive me again if I don't have quite an exhaustive sort of list of artistic references as perhaps you would want. But I was looking at Hogarth and looking at this image on the left, which is the before and after series by William Hogarth. And Stanley Kubrick said that so much of the costumes weren't designed so much as they were simply lifted from the paintings of the period. And again, if you look at Brian O'Neill's costume here compared to the Hogarth painting here, it's almost nearly sort of exactly the same. And I was also thinking of the sort of the presentation of Nora. And I have the sort of semi-impressionistic Shrimp Girl by Hogarth on the right, as to represent again this sort of rustic peasant simplicity compared to Sarah Berenson that we're going to see later on. So again, I'm not sure what you're going to make of this, but in terms of trying to represent, the scene as a visual, what are your interpretations of it?
Well, certainly, I mean, the costume should be remarked upon, because in some cases there are elements of costume which are actually 18th century bits of fabric and clothing. I know that some of the lace was actually 18th century lace that was borrowed and used as elements of the costumes and things. So there was extraordinary attention to those sorts of details. But also, I mean, I think it's important to remember that Kubrick sort of bristled at the idea of that he didn't want this film to look like a conventional period drama, a costume piece. And of course, for Kubrick, who began his career as interestingly enough, as both a gambler and a photographer. So Kubrick, when he was young, to earn money, he played chess. And there were chess clubs in New York, and also there were places in various parks where there were chess tables designed to play chess, and people would play chess and they would do it for money. And Kubrick did it for money, and of course he was very good and had a lifelong interest in chess and was a fairly decent player. And so he supported himself as a kind of gambler. So I've always been slightly fascinated at a parallel between Kubrick and Redmond Barry in this idea of the profession of a gambler, and we see represented so many times in this film, including at the start, where of course the gamble. There's also another kind of gamble. There's a sexual, kind of gamble going on here, and so both he's making analog of the game as being both the game of cards and of course the game of love, to be charitable. But the other thing, of course, that that is so important to kind of depicting this painterly sense. I mean, these sort of references to to the paintings of the period, of course, is that Hogarth would Hogarth understood things in terms of natural light, and painters prior to any sort of significant source of interior illumination would have thought of everything. Everything is in terms, just like a photographer and just like a cinematographer. You've got to think about the quality of the light, where the strength of the light, where the light's coming from, and how the quality of the light will affect your scene. And it was most up to chance. For prior to the 19th century, prior to strong sources of illumination, sort of more powerful gas lighting and lamps and such. So so in a way, I think Kubrick, working in the media of film, of film production, at a time when, of course, it was all physical film, it was emulsion-based film, you were in a way almost limited, even more limited than a painter in Hogarth's age. You had to be very cognizant of the limitations of how you would light these scenes, particularly these interior scenes. And so Kubrick made a very deliberate decision to, most of the scenes that use film lighting, use artificial lighting, the lights are actually were placed outside. The lights are not placed in the interior of the scene. I don't know particularly about this scene because it seems the light is coming from above, and it could be that that window, was sort of high up, and that they could
Well,
place.
these are the famous scenes when it
Well,
comes
these are
to.
these are the ones where there's no film lighting. Yeah, these are the ones that were shot with just candlelight, and these were very, very special and very technically challenging, to the point where Kubrick bought the famous. There's a famous company that produces optics, amongst other things, called Carl Zeiss. And Zeiss had developed in the mid-1960s, they developed a very large aperture lens. In fact, one of the largest lens apertures that had ever been developed, which was a 50 millimeter f.7, if people know anything about photography. It's a very, very fast lens with a very large aperture. And they developed these for the NASA, for the American space program, for the Apollo program. Because the thing about using these lenses with huge aperture is that they would work in situations where there was very limited natural light. These were made to take pictures in almost darkness. And so Kubrick, being very interested in, of course, optics and film technology, ended up buying 3 of these lenses. There were only 10 of them ever made, and Kubrick owned 3 of them, and he had them extensively modified. These were for a still camera. These were for a Hasselblad camera, but of course Kubrick had them modified so that they would fit onto his Mitchell 35 millimeter camera body. And so these lenses, which I believe that Barry Lyndon still has the distinction of having the lowest f-stop used in a film in history for these candlelight scenes. To shoot 35 millimeter motion picture film, I don't know if people know anything about film production. It required a lot of light, and it's very difficult to shoot still photographs in low light, let alone film. So yeah, so there are a few scenes, the ones you're showing, particularly the famous scene here with Lord Ludd, Stephen Burkhoff, the scenes of gambling with the Chevalier and Redmond Barry. Yeah, these were shot only with candles, using these extraordinary optics, and so these were very difficult. And of course, the thing about these is that the thing about using these lenses, these large aperture lenses, is that of course the focus was the focal plane was very, very, very shallow, and so once they were set up, you you had to be very careful how you moved. I mean, it sort of works in these scenes because they're at the gaming table. They're not scenes where there would be particularly a lot of movement or animation amongst the people, but realize that these actors had to sit very still and be very conscious of how they moved, lest they would go out of focus. But so I think this is one of the attempts where Kubrick was really trying to evoke, something which is very difficult to do on film, which certainly at the time, which was to evoke the kind of the way these scenes would have been lit, the way they would have been conceptualized by artists at the period. You would never be able. I don't know. I doubt that you would ever be able to do this because they wouldn't allow you to. I mean, these were National Trust properties, famous buildings, and of course, you're burning 485 candles, which are dripping wax everywhere and spewing spewing lamp black, and also have to constantly be changed. Remember that there's continuity, so the length of the candle has to be constantly measured, and it has to be replaced so that the candles don't appear to kind of go up and down. But anyway, I mean, sort of delving into the technical aspect, but I do think it's important because I think it is one of the ways that Kubrick evoked the kind of spirit of these paintings. And even Thackeray, I mean, was very positively disposed to Hogarth, and is specifically referenced in the source material. So it's not just sort of Kubrick imposing this aesthetic sense onto the film.
Well, the series is a quote-unquote picturesque series. They were picturesque novels when they were re-released as the memoirs of Barry Lyndon. So the copies that I've looked through, again, they're very heavily illustrated, so as to demonstrate these things. And I think in terms of trying to appeal to the idea that it is a comedy, there are many comic illustrations within some of these earlier editions of Thackeray's work. So again, I think in terms of inspiration, the idea of imagery and this work in particular is very apparent. In terms of plot, like I said, we have the young cousin Nora Brady leading Redmond on through a rather sort of interesting placing of the ribbon from which he needs to discover. But nevertheless, she is also courting a English captain, one Captain Quinn, who can bring to the family 1,500 a year, which is the reference. We're talking about these quote unquote gentlemen who are obsessed in terms of being able to shore up their very meager position. This is the beginning of the 7 Years' War. Again, it's not really referenced as to why there's so many English regiments in Ireland itself. The reason being historically is that this is for fear of another Jacobite rising. There's fear that the Bonnie Prince Charlie will be supported by King Louis XV to come back and claim Ireland and claim Scotland. And so there are many regiments for that. But in terms of the association, you have the more superficial reading of it, that it's just, the innocent and the hopelessly sort of lost to love Barry Lyndon, and then you have the avaricious family supporting the English captain and the prospects that he brings along with him. But of course, it's also uh, a allegory for Ireland itself, choosing the option between Catholicism and an Irish authenticity, or Irish particularism, versus the association with trade and commerce and the British Empire and the material advantages that come with supporting England. So as a little allegory, it's a bit on the nose, but
Yeah,
there are yeah.
oh, sorry. There's a line where one of them says, you'll get used to our Irish ways, or else we'll adopt English ones. There's this sort of moment there. Also, just a very brief side note for people who are fans of comedy. One of the family members who is trying to ingratiate Quinn, ingratiate himself towards Quinn, is played by an actor called Patrick Laffan, who famously played a character in Father Ted called Pat Mustard, the Randy Milkman. So if people remembers Father Ted, I was like, oh, there's Pat Mustard with Leonard Rossiter. Strange combination. One other thing, briefly, just politically, of course, is that the production of the film, there were political issues. Of course, this was lots of things were happening with the IRA, and there were many bomb threats issued against the production of the film, to the point where Kubrick ended up leaving Ireland. Apparently, there was a telephone call received that there was a specific threat against Kubrick, and they said if you don't leave Ireland in 24 hours, you and your family are going to be in great danger. And so Kubrick left immediately and never returned. And so there were fears actually that because of this situation, that the film would be abandoned. But Kubrick, the rest of the production occurred in England. But it's interesting that a lot of the kind of early production schedule of the film was using Ireland, in place of Potsdam, in place of other locations. But the political situation, always tempestuous, necessitated a change in venue for the film as well.
Well, I mean, the issue with filming in East Germany, in terms of like Germany, they tend to go to places like Scotland or Swabia or Stuttgart, because, of course, Potsdam and Saxony, etc., were part of East Germany back then. But
And Kubrick was limited, of course, because he would not fly. He would not use airplanes. So his location work was limited to where he could get to, by boat or by car. So hence it was easier to try to find all the locations, in the broader UK and Ireland.
Yes, his first choice actually was to have it all shot in England. He was reluctantly induced to begin filming in Ireland, and of course, as you alluded to, this was 1974, so the height of the Troubles. So it's remarkable in many ways that the film went ahead, and we're very lucky for it, having done so. But there is one particular scene, which is the dancing scene, and just one image that crossed my mind was Jean Watteau's marriage and country dancing. But of course, this is an inciting moment. Nora spends all the time dancing with the English captain, and this is one of the many slights against the impetuous character of the young Barry, of the young Redmond Barry. Again, just emphasizing the book, he gets into fights with everyone. Everything is a point of honor for him. He comments that there's not sort of one boy which he grew up with which he didn't beat up at one point. So he's very practiced at this. He refers to himself as beautiful, attractive, affable, genius. He uses the word genius explicitly many times, but he admits that he's never popular, and it's for this rather egregious reason that he's a lovely little quote from the book that isn't used in the dialogue: bitterly poor but bitterly proud, to summarize the young Redmond Barry. And it's part of his bitter pride that again looks at this action by Nora as a great betrayal, despite the fact everyone telling him that his prospects would be better served essentially by looking elsewhere, and that it's the English captain who is the one essentially ennobling her and not vice versa, because she's the Irish lass without a penny and the avaricious brothers who are trying to force this match, etc. But nevertheless, this is the climate with which we see the beginning of the wedding, and the calamitous state of the duel. And he meets one Captain Grogan, who would later become a patron of his throughout the beginning of the 7 Years' War. But again, it's this notion that he looks into the eyes of Barry as he's Redmond Barry as he's saying, I'm going to kill this man. My love is true and all that sort of thing. And rather than sort of resist the temptation, Grogan looks at this character and says, I completely believe you. There's a burning intensity and honesty, a willfulness that comes across in Barry's character. In terms of eliciting a little bit of the character that we see in the books, it comes forward in those little scenes. But nevertheless, I think Kubrick's intention is very clear, which is to depict the earnest innocence of that man who is dealing with the ramifications of a futile first love, versus, you can say, the some people have interpreted it as revenge against all women and misogyny as we get later on into the story. But from the point of view of the book, that comes across to a much less extent, because that was always to some extent his intention. But of course, we have the duel. As I mentioned earlier, Redmond Barry's father, dies in a duel in 1750. Casanova, one of the figures who inspires the story and the great tour around Europe, of course, is involved in many duels. Duel is, as I referenced for that little passage, a great sort of aristocratic pastime. Just a tiny little history on the duel. Of course, it evolves out of trial by combat, single combat, where your sword, singing would essentially gift the judgment of the gods. But by the beginning of the 17th century, especially in France, we have the Code Dueling, the rules governing duels. So, despite the fact that it was becoming illegal everywhere, ever since the beginning of the 13th century, there had been prohibitions against this, ad hoc single combat, trial by combat. It was illegal everywhere, but practiced everywhere. There was very little in terms of culling this sort of great aristocratic pastime, and I think the only thing really that caused dueling to fall into abeyance wasn't the extension of the law, but rather the overall decline of the aristocracy throughout Europe. It seems to be ubiquitous for the aristocracy throughout history. For that reason, it is practiced prolifically everywhere, even in Tipperary, which to Barry again is a very important place in Ireland. There is a dueling code, the quote unquote 26 commandments regulating the practice as late as 1777, so after the period in the story in which he's married. And it's only again when we have the overall decline of the aristocracy and the Bow Street runners and the rise of a quote unquote professional police system that there is even some form of scrutiny for this. The last fatal duel, it should be mentioned, was fought in England in 1845, around the time of the publication of The Luck of Barry Lyndon by Thackeray. So again, Barry Lyndon, when he's writing his memoirs, he's looking at this whole idea of the duel and the honourable trial by combat as a great point of pride. And it is a loss to an aristocratic culture. And it is again one of these victims of the revolutions that we see such quote unquote cruel and unusual and seigneurial lordly practices, which are not to be undertaken by these austere men, as we're going to refer to them, versus the men of quote unquote fashion. But nevertheless, his satisfaction, his honor demands that as Quinn essentially has inveigled himself and placed himself as wanting to win the suit of Nora Brady, and as Barry essentially is completely head over heels in love with her, regardless of everyone telling him that she is not worth his time whatsoever and a complete flake. He is intending to go to this duel whatsoever. He's bribed to go, both in the story and in the film. He doesn't go. And as it turns out, there is a bit of a plot twist later on, but for all intents and purposes, it seems that Barry wins the duel and fatally kills the English captain. And of course, it being technically illegal, he is now guilty of murder, even though in many cases the murder charge didn't stick often due to the practices associated with duels and the whole regulations around them. But nevertheless, the fear is that the constabulary is going to come round and he needs to escape. And so we begin the great trek, the grand tour of Barry, which will find him, visiting all of these sort of great courts of France and the Low Countries and Germany. But before I sort of go on to the the adventures of Barry Lyndon the adventurer, what do you think of this scene?
I really like this this scene, of course, because it's a parallel, of course, the drama of the loss of his father, except, of course, as we learn, it's a farce. Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of his history is first tragedy and comedy, and of course, I mean, even the way that Kubrick handles the shooting of this. I mean, there's this idea that in all of Kubrick films that at least one character does something which people have called the Kubrick stare, which is this sort of where you put your chin very low to your chest, but then you look up with your eyes over your brow, famously done by Jack Nicholson in The Shining and Malcolm McDowell in Clockwork Orange. Otherwise, this film, of course, doesn't really have an example of that, but Kubrick very much liked to, just like Hogarth in a way, to sort of use the kind of inherent ridiculous quality of certain people, where their kind of shortcomings manifest themselves in their appearance or in their face, and Kubrick often shot the human face in certain moments of extremity, in a kind of deliberately weird and distorted way. And there's a shot of Quinn right before they fire, where the camera is slightly lower than his face, and it's sort of he's sort of wild-eyed looking down the barrel of the pistol, his hands sort of wavering, and you know again, Kubrick was using the kind of the sort of Leonard Roster plays Quinn as he's slightly ridiculous, I mean, you almost get the sense that, I mean, he's meant to be this figure of respectability, but of course, you get the sense that his honor is just as kind of shaky as the other characters.
It's wonderful. He's trembling.
Yeah,
He's cowardly. He's trying to compose himself as
yeah,
best as possible. He's trying to not let it through, but it's just oozing out of him.
yeah.
I looked at that and was kind of in awe in terms of that perfect encapsulation of the gentleman coward which Quinn is.
Yeah, and of course, contrasted with with Redmond, who is in this scene, as in many scenes. I mean, even of course to his ultimate detriment, but is filled with purpose and is stalwart about what he's about to do. But of course, his conception of what's happening here and what is actually happening here, there is that difference again. What you're seeing on the screen is, you just assume that everything is honest and manifest, but we learn, of course, that he's been tricked later on, when they learn that, of course, his bullet was replaced by a plug of tow, as Grogan tells him slightly later on. So
Spoilers, D.
sorry about that. I assumed that we assumed spoilers here, but sorry.
Just one. This, of course, is paraphrasing a lot of different quotes that come forward in the book. But again, as he's sort of throwing the glass at Quinn, the sort of nuptial feast. I will not apologize, and I'd soon go to Dublin's to hell. I will not apologize again. Could as well be his motto of the great Barry Lyndon estate. He will make no apologies for any of his actions. It's part of his sort of pseudo aristocratic demeanor that sort of goes with him regardless. I just want to point out there are lots of very sort of pregnant landscape shots and images, and again, I couldn't help but think of some sort of allusions, conscious allusions to Gainsborough. So this is a Suffolk landscape, and this one in particular, with landscape tree and weir. Again, it's the sky in particular I found
Yeah.
mesmerizing about many of the shots that we see,
And the
landscape
paint
shots we see.
Yeah, and the painter has a great advantage, of course, because the painter has an opportunity to, to kind of fix these very transitory, kind of moments in time. When you're filming with a full film crew, a 35 millimeter film with with a budget and a schedule and all that, particularly particularly in Ireland, where the people have noted the weather is quite transitory. it like to get this shot. I just imagine the amount of waiting and the amount of false starts that were required to get this moment, on film, and very difficult. So again, the painter has an advantage of being able to kind of compress and fix time in a way, and to sort of choose, these passing moments as he likes. But for the photographer, the cinematographer, yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot that has to go into getting this perfect moment. This is one of the more striking shots in the film, I think. I mean, the
Well,
other thing that gives the quality the visual quality, is that it's noticeable. I mean, if you watch a very good copy of the film, it's very grainy. This is something, of course, that we don't think about. Well, it's added artificially now, strangely enough, in film shot on digital video. But of course, an emulsion film was it was an emulsion. It was metallic particles of silver, you know, stuck to a piece of plastic, and so, of course, depending on the size of those particles, depending on the quote speed of the film will be more or less grainy. And of course, Kubrick was forced to choose a fairly fast film because of the lower lighting conditions. So the faster the film, of course, the more prevalent the grain would be. But I think the grain ends up almost being a kind of analog for the kind of brush strokes, the kind of feel of a painting. So I find this very, very beautiful aspect of the film. But yeah, it's interesting you put that shot, because it's very striking.
speaking of the aesthetics more generally, it's time really to talk about the score. Now, the score is very iconic, and again, I was looking into Kubrick's thoughts on this, and he was very insistent on getting authentic period music, 18th century music. Um, in many of his films, he sort of does away with a more conventional film score. So, for example, there is an iconic composer which is associated with many of his films. In the case of The Shining, perhaps people don't even know it. It's Bela Bartok. In the case of 2001, of course, it's Johann Strauss.
Yeah.
In the case here, it's Handel. In particular, Handel's Sarabande. And what I find very interesting is that compared to the great English artists of, I'm going to, we're referencing many here, England doesn't really produce any sort of composers of note in terms of the sort of European stage. We have Purcell, obviously, and Tallis in the 17th century, but in the 18th century, Handel, of course, is German, Hanoverian patronage. I think he comes from no, Halle or somewhere near Hanover, even though that would be sort of in Lower Saxony. But anyway, he comes over, is patronized, has these very sort of grandiose opera, composes the coronation anthem, water music, etc. But Sarabande in particular is not so much a leitmotif, but essentially it is the piece of music that punctuates all of the most dramatic moments throughout the film.
Yeah.
Indeed, the first duel and the final duel. It's almost not an overture, but something grander and more all-encompassing in terms of a tone setter for the rest of the film. I mean, there are other pieces of music as well, works by Mozart. And Vivaldi. I would say one sort of semi-incongruous piece of music is Schubert towards the end. And Stanley Kubrick even admits this. He believes that it was slightly incongruous. He wanted to preserve as many sort of 18th century pieces of music as possible, but he believed that Schubert was as far as he was willing to go in terms of breaking out of the. He essentially believed that there was no sort of great sort of tragic romantic pieces of music in the 18th century, which I think is a very controversial position to hold. But nevertheless, that was his view. And so he believed Schubert essentially was the way of remedying that, even though it's beyond this sort of period in history. But in terms of dramatic Baroque pieces of music, you can't sort of go wrong with Handel.
No, I should mention, of course, that the piece that is used is actually from Handel wrote keyboard suites. I mean, harpsichords, when they would have been harpsichord suites at the time. That they're now, you can hear them performed on piano, various instruments. This one is it's the saraband from the D minor keyboard suite. And if you want to know, the Handel opus number is HWV 437. And people familiar with with classical music, quote classical music, chamber music. For these types of things, they would the each of the component parts of these suites would be named after a dance. So a saraband is a type of dance, and the jig and the courant and allemande. I mean, you will hear these words used in music, particularly of the 18th century, and these would be allusions to dance, and they would be allusions to perhaps the tempi used in the piece. But if you're looking for this particular one, yes, it's the keyboard suite in D minor. It's interesting that he chose it because, of course, it's I think just perfectly appropriate and is so now iconically associated with this film. But it's not a grand motif that Handel that was particularly notable in Handel's work. It's a relatively minor component of a piece of chamber music. So kind of fascinating. But the same happens, of course, with the Schubert. That is from the E flat piano trio. That piece of Schubert's that's used, but it's so sort of wedded with the tone of the kind of the end of this film that you sort of forgive it in a way. It's interesting that I've always regarded Schubert and Beethoven's death as the proper end of this line of who we call kind of classical composers, really 1827, 1828. So in a way, I kind of include them, even though technically, of course, they go beyond this sort of romantic period of 18th century music. But yeah, it's interesting bringing that up. There's another piece which is used in during the gambling, so one of the gambling scenes, the one that we'd seen the still with Stephen Berkoff. It's a piece by a slightly obscure composer called Paisiello, and it's from his opera The Barber of Seville, which people will say, oh well, I thought that Mozart wrote The Barber of Seville, but it's another version of that story. And indeed, Mozart may have been aware of this, but it's the cavatina, a little song from that opera. So yeah, those pieces of music, and there's also in the early part of the film, there's also a lot of traditional Irish music. That I know the chieftains were involved in producing quite a bit of music for the film.
Well, it's interesting again, isn't it, that I was about to note that there are original compositions, many Irish pieces, as you mentioned, but none have sort of reached the iconic status as reusing these classical pieces from the 18th century. I mean, it's quite controversial. You're putting it sort of 1827, 1828 is the sort of the end of that sort of era of classical composition. I would perhaps put it much earlier, but nevertheless, I think there is something revealing in terms of his issuing the traditional usage of film score, because when we're thinking about classical music sort of evolving into film score, that's a much later development, of course, because film is a much later development. We're talking about the early sort of 19th century. You can see, what's his name, Saint-Saëns, Mahler, and other composers like that, who are sort of the vehicles in many ways of translating the classical repertoire into film music. And I think really in terms of the whole structure of film music, it really sort of, it doesn't begin with Wagner, but Wagner is the great sort of launch pad in terms of the total work of art and the music drama becoming the film score. So I think there's something rather authentic in terms of it not having a conventional film score, because that in itself is a much later innovation of the romantic period, the true romantic period of quote unquote classical music composition in the 1850s. So returning again to these I'm not going to say sort of less grand pieces of music, but eschewing the whole sort of development of classical music going forward, I think is actually a way of keeping in the spirit of the times as well.
Yeah, I mean, even the symphony, was, I mean, it's sort of partially invention of Haydn, but the symphony, the kind of manifestation of the symphony that people tend to think about is really in the 19th century. Even the early manifestations of this kind of form were not really totally kind of codified at this point. So the music would have been more intimate. I mean, of course, as I said, he's expanded out. I mean, this bit from one of Handel's harpsichord suites, he's expanded it in, and used it as this grand motif, but it still, I think, retains the kind of intimacy that was still part of music. This was prior to the innovation of the concert hall, filled with, ladies of leisure fainting over Franz Liszt's hair, in the 19th century. I mean, this was, and of course there's a famous scene in Barry Lyndon, perhaps we'll get to later, which involves a kind of musicale performed at Castle Howard. I can't remember if it's actually filmed there, but yeah, famously, where Barry's nature sort of intrudes upon all the kind of polite conventions of of this intimate chamber music. So but it's fascinating, and it's very much in keeping with Kubrick's. So famously in 2001: A Space Odyssey, he commissioned a composer called Alex North to write a score. And there is a complete orchestral score for 2001, and Kubrick heard it and he said, well, I actually like the placeholder music that I use better than this, so I'm just not going to use it. And so famously, he had the whole score written and orchestrated and recorded, and then used, instead used Strauss and Ligeti and Penderecki and other composers. Now, of course, famously, that music, a lot of people think that the music in 2001, or some of the music in The Shining, or whatever, they think it was actually composed for those films, but it wasn't. All of those strange atonal pieces of music that you hear in those films were all things done by avant-garde composers. Mentioned Ligeti and Penderecki, particularly, but that was a Kubrick thing, really, to use pre-recorded music, and really none of his films. I mean, some of his films have original music, but I don't think any of the Kubrick films, perhaps with the exception of Paths of Glory, has its own full original score.
And just for reference, in terms of the transition of the symphony, the very sort of conventional start date in terms of the classical symphony and the quote-unquote sort of more romantic symphony is Beethoven's Third Symphony in, what was it, 1805? But anyway, fascinating sort of conversation about music. We have to sort of continue on with the plot. He's sent away on his exile after this farce with 20 guineas, and he arrives at a little pub, and there is this rather sort of interesting gentleman, spectacled gentleman, this captain, saying,
favorite characters, by the way.
would you care to join us for some lunch, good sir? And Redmond thinks nothing of it and just continues on his way. There is a tree blocking the passage on the road to Dublin, and all of a sudden that same spectacled gentleman comes out, and it's none other than Captain James Feeney. And I was fascinated sort of looking into the character. This is a real character, a real historical character. In the Betrayal, he's Feeney, but in reality, he's Freeney. And they refer to him as the Irish Robin Hood. And like Casanova, he was the author of a popular autobiography regaling his adventures. And it's fascinating sort of looking at the sort of the lore behind the Irish Highwaymen, because they were seen as part of the Catholic resistance. They were associated with the Cavalier tradition against Cromwell, going all the way back to the middle of the 17th century. They were also referred to as Tories, which of course comes from the Irish word for pursuer. So Captain James Freeney is one of these sort of authentic Irish Tories. We think of Dick Turpin, etc. in England, but Ireland has its own sort of romanticism when it comes to the Highwaymen. And in just terms of like trying to situate this within the sort of broader Irish culture, I just have this short segment from Leakey's England and Ireland in the 18th century. What a dread of justice or punishment can be expected from an Irish peasant in a state of wretchedness and extreme penury, in which, if the first man that met him were to knock him on the head and give him everlasting relief from his distressed and penurious life, he might have reason to think it a friendly and meritorious action, and many of them bear their abject state with patience as to me sufficient proof of their natural civility of their disposition. All this is to say that the Irish lot in life was rather grim compared to many places in Europe. And one of the sort of remarkable things that I always think about Ireland is that despite Ireland's condition and relative poverty compared to the rest of Europe and less sort of state of development compared to especially the industrial revolution occurring in like northwest England, etc., in the Midlands, is the overpopulation. The population of Ireland around this time was 4 million, which is roughly comparable to the population of Ireland that we have today. It was massively overpopulated and very poor, and society was very uneven. And so, in a society like that, these highwaymen, again, were seen as the great heroic rebel. And in the book, again, it takes on a slightly different angle. The whole thing is recontextualized and streamlined for the sake of the film. But in the book, it really emphasizes the point you were bringing up earlier, which is that Redmond is the imposter. He of the sort of people he encounters, again, the names escape me at the moment, but he begins to embark on these grand stories about his lineage and all the great things he's going to accomplish, and him being of aristocratic stock, etc. And he's discovered and he is robbed. But during that time, again, he is able to present himself as a great hero by happening upon a woman who has already been robbed by a highwayman. But in this situation, he is the victim of a highway robbery. And I think if you look at the implications that he is a Protestant and his mother was considered the quote unquote English widow, it has a completely different implication if you look at it in terms of the context provided by the book as opposed to by the film, because then you can understand the Irish Robin Hood's actions and why he would target someone as hapless as Redmond Barry, who of course will present himself as this great scion of Irish royalty, and nevertheless he's still seen as a collaborator with the English regime in Ireland. So a lot of different things are going on in quite a comedic scene, all things put aside.
Yeah, indeed, and I like I really like the actor in this scene. Those fine pair of boots, which in ordinary circumstances I would take for myself, allow you to have them. And of course, the transactional nature of the whole thing, of course, because Captain Feely presents it as a kind of, maybe a slightly involuntary transaction, but a transaction that's much the same, including, of course, all the politesse, expected of a business transaction. So, I quite like this scene.
Yes, and he frames it such rather explicitly. So our protagonist, as a result of this, is impoverished. And what do impoverished men, fleeing the law, do in this situation? Well, there happen to be recruiters all across the British Isles because the great Frederick is in Germany fighting a war, and we're fighting a war against the French in Canada. So all of these opportunities are there for the worst elements of society to find, their shilling in the service of king and country. And so he falls essentially into recruitment as a mere private in the British Army and the Royal Army at a time where Britain is fighting a massive war against France and against Austria. And you can look at this and say the implications in the book are very severe for young Redmond, because, of course, him being a gentleman and him, looking at his sort of grand pedigree and stock and his inexhaustible supply of personal pride, the idea that he would enter the army as a mere private, is a complete sort of horror to him. And of course, in the book again, it's made more explicit with the idea of not even being able to afford um, supplies and a uniform, etc., and having to be kitted out by his mother. But of course, in the film, all of these things are sort of handed to him.
Yeah.
It's not made explicitly obvious. Again, the whole sort of economic aspects of being a soldier. It's not quite as explicit. But never, and you don't, of course, because of the whole nature of the framing device, you don't. I think this is a moment where the film suffers when it comes to, what are his personal thoughts regarding this whole sort of denigration and this experience of basically being forced to become a soldier of fortune.
Yeah.
The only relief for Ryan O'Neill's Barry, Redmond Barry in this situation is to discover that, of course, Grogan, who he had essentially enraptured back with his sort of earnest and fiery determination to, win the hand of Nora and be rid of Quinn. It is here that Grogan informs the young private of the farce of which he was originally again subjected to in the first place. And again, you can almost say the tragedy of it all, that having been robbed and having basically placed himself as a soldier of fortune in the British Army, due to the whole setup in which he was forced to leave, he finds out that, of course, Nora is married to the Captain Quinn, so he's lost that. But also, he can't leave the army now because to leave now would be a deserter. So in many ways, you can say he's lost everything. And from the character in the book, again, there are many admonitions that he will come back, and he will come back greater as, the proprietor of this great estate and a lord, and many of these things. So it's incumbent upon the young Barry to find a way out of this abject state of misery and servitude, it should be mentioned, from the point of view of the film and the book. It's represented as a form of semi-slavery. And so Grogan and his patronage by the amiable captain is the only relief that he can find in this situation. And another moment that I think struck me before reading the book, so like you, I watched the film first before I read the book, is his fight with O'Toole, the great sort of lumbering bully of the regiment of grenadiers, in that he wins very easily against O'Toole, despite O'Toole being again, twice his size. And I was wondering, okay, how did that happen? He's almost like with the duel and being able to hit Grogan, etc. Sorry, hit Quinn, etc. It almost seems as if Barry is too proficient when it comes to certain sort of martial abilities. And I was looking at this, and of course, in the book, you find out that he's been fighting his entire life. He's been picking fights with everyone else. So it's perfectly understandable from the book character how he's able to win such fights, like, with a lumbering oaf like O'Toole, but nevertheless, that doesn't come across in the film. And I think this is where the lack of flashbacks hurt the film in many ways to his youth, because again, it plays such an important part of framing his character. So I would probably say this is the weakest part of the film in terms of sort of getting all these intentions and motivations across, because you have to infer so much in terms of his situation, and it's only sort of later you get this impression later on, really towards the end of the first half of the film, what he really thinks about this horrific situation in which he's being forced into.
Yeah, the only hint really towards the the idea of him having having this idea of himself as having a aristocratic lineage is I mean, it's just a mere hint, but the scene I think that precedes his engagement with O'Toole is he complains. He's like, "Oh my, this beaker's full of grease. Can I have another one?" And it's just like the only sort of hint that he would have, these sort of aristocratic, ideas of what's acceptable in terms of hygiene and proper serving, properly being served food. So, but I mean, that's not going to come through if you're not aware of it. It's just another one of those moments. Before I forget, of course, there's a very explicit reference to William Hogarth in the scene where he meets the recruitment officer. The scene begins with a close-up of a an inn or tavern sign, which is called "Health to the Barley Mow," which is a reference to one of Hogarth's very famous engravings, which is called it's a set. One of them is called Beer Street, and the other one is called Gin Lane. And one is, of course, Beer Street is presented as, of course, a kind of prosperity and health, of the tradition of drinking ale and the fecundity of the harvest, and then of course Gin Lane is the kind of skeletal, sort of dire outcome of following down the evil path of Gin Lane. But yes, in Beer Street, there's also a sign that which Kubrick replicates in the scene. So I like the moments where there are very explicit references to the art of the period, not just inspiration, but actual sort of, if you know, you know.
Yes, obviously I don't have every sort of visual reference up here. I could only sort of manage a few things through my own inference. But another painting, which again I probably should have put up, is that scene you mentioned where he was complaining about the grease and getting into the fight with O'Toole, has a ruined fort castle as a backdrop. And again, that's a another painting. I don't recall if it's by Gainsborough, but
Yeah, if I'm familiar, but I can't remember exactly the painting. This, by the way, is the battle that where the narrator says, it's not recorded in any history book. So this is not it's not a specific engagement, at least in the terms of the film. I don't know in the book if there's more kind of information about this.
well, I mean, within the book, he fights the Battle of Minden, which is the sort of the great sort of English Hanoverian victory. And when it comes to the Prussian army, a couple of years later, he's involved in the Battle of Kunersdorf, which is the great sort of disaster which nearly destroys Prussia, where the entire army is essentially disbanded, and after 50,000 men being committed to the battle, the quote unquote Great Frederick is only able to muster some 3,000 men in the immediate aftermath of that battle. But there's a moment again where Horden is the narrator saying, it would take a great sort of greater philosopher and historian than I to fathom the reasons of the 7 Years' War and that sort of thing, which is a quote I like because it's taken from the book and it's repurposed slightly, because it's quite a revealing moment from the character construction of Redmond, in the sense that he's not so much interested in history rather than his own predicament. He doesn't. He's only sort of imbibing the cause of what is going on in the 7 Years' War from other people. And of course, when you juxtapose it with the narrator having that view, it takes on an entirely sort of different atmosphere as a result of it, as if the reader shouldn't be concerned about the causes of the war. But of course, many people were concerned about the causes of the war at the time, of course. One of the reasons, again, stated in the book, but not in the film, is that with, William, with Pitt the Elder, the later Earl of Chatham, so vigorously defending the cause of Britain in that war and allying himself to the quote unquote Great Frederick. Frederick was seen, or Prussia, as a great Protestant hero fighting off against the evil Catholic and Papist Austrians and the French. And of course, this would allow for the British Empire to be established in earnest, while the Prussians are, felling all our continental enemies on the battlefield. So there are many very interesting reasons as to why Protestants in particular will be motivated to fight for this cause. But as we'll later see when it comes to the motley sort of assemblage under Frederick's army, how complicated and in many ways sort of tragic the elements the soldiers were fighting. And I think, again, this is where his Protestant versus his Catholic upbringing, I think, should have a bearing on his considerations and indeed his motivations to be able to continue on the conflict. The fact that, again, the Barrys have converted to Protestantism for, brief sort of social advantage. But as we see with the Chevalier, there's a deep sort of Catholic sort of vein which carries through the family. But the character that you see right in the middle, bayonet in hand, is, of course, Redmond, but the character in front of him is Grogan. Now, it's a wonderful scene to watch because it's a sterling example of discipline of these line regiments as they're marching into battle. In this case, fixed bayonets. They're about to They're about to do a melee charge, whilst the French line are, peppering them with fire as they're going along. And Grogan in particular, again, the direction is to be completely immovable, not in the sense, he's not marching forward, but in the sense that he's completely unaffected by all of his comrades being shot around him. And of course, he does end up getting shot. And everyone seems, unconcerned except Redmond, of course, because Grogan was his protector and possibly the only sort of relief he had in the army. So he takes Grogan away, tries to see if there's any possibility of him surviving. But of course, Grogan knows he's done for. Laments the fact that he had left him some 100 guineas in his will, but of course has spent it the entire night before on the table. So any sort of inheritance that he would have received is now gone. And just a little note, kiss me before I die. Of course, people who are in any way familiar with Lord Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar know about the famous "Kiss Me, Hardy." I just wanted to ask you: is there any, again, particular reason why, in the military sort of culture of the 18th century, why soldiers, kissed each other in this way?
I'm not aware. I'm not aware of any sort of tradition of that. I mean, I know that was a thing. I mean, certainly, there's a sort of expression of personal intimacy, and the kiss is a kind of, apart from any of the romantic connotations, but it just being a kind of seal, of a bond. And I think that certainly in the way the film portrays it, the bond between Grogan and Redmond was almost sort of familial. It was sort of like a father, son, or an uncle and a nephew or something. So, yeah, but I don't know particularly the history of that. I remember that line very well. "Kiss me, my boy, because we'll never meet again." But no, I don't know what connotation that would have related to Nelson or any sort of larger military tradition.
I mean, the only thing I can think of is that that has feudal connotations. The kiss, in particular, in deference to one's liege and a sign of reciprocal loyalty, beyond the modern romantic connotations. And of course, if you remove the hierarchical and feudal elements of society, then you're only left with the romantic association, in which case it comes across as rather odd.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, I think, well, for me, I think of the kind of sadly gone out now, but the tradition of of kissing the ring of of a sort of hierarchical person in the church. I mean, whether it's the Pope or whether it's a bishop or whatever. I mean, this is a kind of tradition associated, as I said, with kind of fealty, or as a kind of seal of fealty and allegiance to the ecclesiastical office and the connotation thereof. So it may be more of a Catholic thing. And being of significant Irish extraction myself, perhaps it's just more of a, I'd wondered if it was being presented as, again, a sort of aspect of the kind of Irishness, sort of contrasted with the sort of perhaps more removed or sort of cool way that English soldiers would have had.
But of course, compared to Quinn, Grogan is Irish.
Yeah.
And it's part of the stigma actually attached to Grogan, and the reason perhaps why he didn't, he wasn't raised higher in the ranks. The only relief that Grogan could offer the young Redmond is promoting him to corporal. But nevertheless, a corporal is still not significant in terms of what he imagined would be a commissioned rank, as in to be a lieutenant within the army at least. And so this leads to the next scene, which is his determination to desert now his protector is gone. Within the whole sort of story of the original novel, it's more sort of insidiously played out. Within the film, it's portrayed as a moment of opportunism, whereby you have the two officers, giving each other, sending each other sweet words in the lake, as they're worried off, as this, Lieutenant Fakenham has to bear this message to Bremen. and whether they're going to see each other once again. Talking about the kiss from earlier.
Yeah,
um,
a different sort of kiss, I suppose. I mean, and this scene, of course, is played. Again for its sort of ridiculousness, and it's played as farcically as a sort of comedy.
but the point of that scene is, regardless of whatever it's trying to say beyond the overly sort of uh, exaggerated sort of elements of that relationship, is that it provides the young Redmond the opportunity to assume the, because again, such a consistent theme throughout this film is that Redmond is an imposter. And so once again, the would-be Irish, prince has decided to assume the rank of a lieutenant and try to use this way to desert the army by going over to Cuxhaven or Bremen and then going over to the Netherlands, which was neutral during that conflict. This is put more explicitly in the book, but it's quite significant again in terms of the character difference, because a lot of the criticism sent against this film is that he's a very passive character. He's a character sort of witnessing events or being
Yeah.
caught up in events. Whereas in the book, this is a far darker chapter in which he literally gags him, holds him down and takes all of his possessions, the lieutenant, away in terms of being able to carry on and desert from the army. It's a malicious act within the book, as opposed to this chance encounter that he has within the film, and as a result of it, the entire context of it's changed. From this point of view, the film is very much trying to present him as a victim in this conflict, and indeed, from the way the film is presented up until now, he's been the victim of this great artifice to get him out of the way and allow for Quinn to marry Nora, find himself as a soldier, lose his protector, and now he's in essentially a fight in which he doesn't believe. If we're going to look at the causes, he's not too concerned with them. It's a matter for the historians and the philosophers, and so he wants to leave. But within the book, again, it's a matter of I deserve better. It is incumbent on my rank basically to seize any and all opportunities for advancement. That's the explicit rationale within the book, and he takes it. But nevertheless, from there, the events proceed very much as they do in the book, which is he essentially the whole romance plot is somewhat recontextualized within the book compared to the film, but nevertheless it carries on in that same way. And the way again that Horden, as the omniscient narrator, shows sympathy for the war widow, quote unquote, and the deserter, Barry Lyndon, as trying to justify that sort of relationship and the fickle nature of romance and war and that sort of thing, and having those sort of momentary sort of elements of comfort. It then goes to, you can say, a very, actually, before I move on to that, I just want to talk about the music again, which is, of course, the leitmotif of the British officers, of course, the Grenadier March, which is, thundering as this march is going on. And of course, it's contrasted later with another great military march. But going on from there, he encounters a Prussian, a Prussian soldier. And again, the context from the book to the film is very different. Barry in the film is happy when he sees the Prussians because he's saying, "Oh well, I'm away from the English, and that means that's a good thing apparently." But it's not a good thing because the Prussians are allied to the British, and that means he's still involved in the war. In the book, he's happy because he marches over into Hesse, not because he marches over into Prussia. And there's a huge amount of conniving done by the Prussians to capture him in the book. But in the film, he basically just sort of haphazardly sort of enters into that situation where he becomes a captor for the Prussian army. But just to contextualize this, the Prussians have been fighting you can almost say in terms of the 18th century, the closest thing you can come to a total war. The Prussians have lost so many battles. They're fighting wars on all fronts. They have lost many great battles. I mentioned they've won the Battle of Rossbach. They've won the Battle of uh, I've forgotten the Battle of Hohenlinden. They've lost the Battle of Kunersdorf, as I alluded to. And so there are these recruiters going around trying to entrap and capture anyone of any flag, of any creed, of any race to join in the Prussian army. And in the book, Barry is essentially hoodwinked by the prospect of meeting one of the most beautiful women in the world, and he effectively walks straight into a Prussian military encampment. But within the film, he imagines that he can pull over this Captain Putzdorf, who is the amalgamation of many characters into a single, rather unlikely, improbable character that we see within the film. And there's this wonderful little scene where he's at a tavern with Putzdorf in the film, and he's talking about his great lineages and his connections. And again, this is the combination of many scenes that we have in the book that are all front loaded here. And he basically says at the end of this, Putzdorf, asks about, oh, what general are you sending your dispatches to? And then this is a revealing moment because Potsdam knows that the general he's talking about has been dead for the last 10 months. But what's so funny is that he later goes on to say, in terms of the many lists of errors that he committed in his story, the idea that you are related to a British ambassador who has the preposterous name of O'Brady.
O'Brady, yeah. I like that. Yeah. And also, of course, I mean, noting the fact that the identity that he'd assumed is someone called Fakenham. I mean, literally a fake. I don't know whether that was a deliberate choice or not, but
No, I don't think that's any sort of name in this is very surprising. But yes, assuming the title of Lieutenant Fakenham, and it's in this again in the book, it's insidious to the point where even if he weren't a deserter, it's likely he would have been abducted by the Prussian armies. The Prussians within the film are seen as more honourable within that situation, and of course within the book, you're told about the Saxon candidate who's basically captured, and all the Frenchmen who have been prisoners of war who effectively been sold off as these martial slaves into the Prussian army. In the book, there's this whole subplot about a mutiny that's going on in the Prussian army of all the essentially the captured soldiers, and how this is brutally put down. And the worst aspect again of serving under the Prussian army is that this young Redmond, who had very few prospects of advancement within the English army, has absolutely no prospects of advancement within the Prussian army, even though he saves the life of Putzdorf. He's given a couple of Frederick Dorr, gold pieces, gold Fredericks. But nobility, of course, is the exclusive, privilege afforded to the officers. They have the service nobility. You can only be an officer if you're a noble. There is no sort of opportunity for advancement for enlisted men, and regardless of Barry's pretensions, he is not going to convince the Prussian king that he is an Irish princeling as much as he would assume that rank. And so he survives the entire war rather improbably. And again, it's this horrific moment for young Redmond when, despite having endured everything that he's endured, and despite having saved the life of the man who was also his captor, he is accused of being, again, an element of the worst and the lowest and the most corrupt society in all of Europe at that time. And so the colonel who is giving him his Golden Frederick is both elevating him and admonishing him for his foul character at the same time. So there is no relief, as if again to emphasize that the character has, in the state of essentially trying to survive, he has fallen and he has become, the rake that we're going to see throughout the rest of the film.
yeah, indeed. The other thing, just to going back to music, but the music used to represent his service in the Prussian army.
Yeah,
Is
the Hohenfriedberger March. Yeah,
written by Frederick himself. I don't know if people are aware, but Frederick was quite a prolific composer and apparently a fairly talented musician, particularly on he played the flute. And very famously, one of the great works of music in the work of J.S. Bach is that Bach came to Frederick's court. I mean, he was associated with with Frederick and patronage. Bach's one of Bach's sons as well. I think C.P.E. Bach was patronized by Frederick, but Frederick famously said, "I'm going to give you to J.S. Bach." He said, "I'm going to give you a theme, and I want you to compose fugues and variations on this theme." And so he proceeded to play this melody, which is really one of the more a difficult. When one hears it, it's difficult to imagine taking inspiration from this and being able to do anything with it. I mean, it was deliberately a challenge, but Bach went off and wrote one of his great works, which is called the Musical Offering, based on this theme. And so you hear it. The very first is the statement of the theme, which was written by Frederick the Great. So a character very much associated with music of the period. But it's interesting that, of course, one of his works is used in the film to represent his service in the Prussian army.
Well, again, it's wonderful that that was incorporated, because not only was he a composer, he was a renowned flautist.
Yeah.
He obviously entertained many musicians, philosophers, scholars at Sanssouci, his great Orangerie Palais in Potsdam. And despite the fact that he cultivated this image of him, which later Napoleon would basically copy, of being, the old Fritz, the worn, sort of bedraggled soldier who was toiling and suffering the same privations of his soldiers. He also cultivates this air of the enlightened despot. The whole notion of enlightened despotism is attributed to him. I believe the quote is "everything for the people, nothing by the people." Which is the Frederikian maxim. But of course, he had to partake in all of the elements. And of course, what better than the greater hero Marshal King also composed his own military marches. But Redmond survives, and puts him in a position essentially of being a police spy, which is better than remaining a corporal in the army with no possibility of any advancement. So this would seem to be some relief. But he places him in the position of being a spy on this new character, this new interesting personality in Potsdam, one Chevalier de Balibari. And the idea essentially is that he is attached to the Austrian embassy, but the assumption is that he is really spying for the Austrians, because the Austrians are being defeated. They're not very happy about the loss of the Silesian region, and they're going to want to take it back again. And of course, the Saxons are also embittered by the fact of being occupied throughout this war. So despite the fact there is peace, Prussia is still surrounded on all sides by enemies. And so there is the suspicion that this Chevalier de Balibari is none other than an Irishman, and that this is a unique opportunity for Redmond to be of use, essentially to win over the favor of this man masquerading essentially as a French noble. And again, it alludes to the Casanova Chevalier personality that we saw, because all of these characters to some extent are imposters of one sort or the other. And from the abduction, I just wanted to point out, you mentioned the scenes in Potsdam, this image in particular, which is the new palace in Potsdam. I was looking at this picture and saying, this looks oddly familiar, not in the sense of the palace itself, but it invokes something. And here we have a very famous landscape by Bernardo Bellotto, of Vienna as seen from the Belvedere, and of course in terms of also being placed between the two domes. I think that the conscious association is very deliberate, which is ironic in a way, because Bellotto was patronized by the Venetians, of course, he being Italian, and he was patronized by the Duke of Saxony, and who was also the King of Poland, but he wasn't patronized by the Prussians. So you have many shots in Vienna, many beautiful sort of beautiful sort of architectural landscapes in Venice, in Dresden, and in Warsaw, but none in Prussia, Berlin, or Potsdam. So this, in many ways, you can say is Kubrick trying to make up for the fact that no such painting would exist. By recreating his own version of Potsdam, and again, it's rather sort of idyllic, but of course, it's a fabrication because the palace that we're sent to is actually in Stuttgart. It's not in what was then East Germany. Um, as we mentioned before, the various reasons why it was essentially off limits for Kubrick to become, a globetrotter in that sense. But we finally come.
Yeah, these would be second unit shots that Kubrick, that Kubrick did not attend the filming of.
Yes, exactly.
So similar things. I mean, in Shining, there are again famously the beginning of the film, the drive to the overlook. That's all second unit things. So Kubrick would not have been present. So but yeah, there are shots outside of England and Ireland. If you that just I don't know, of interest, the uh, Kubrick reused that interior where you see Captain Pottsdorf and Barry, that you saw that sort of greenish. Yeah, this one. This is in a house in Ireland called Powerscourt. Powerscourt Estate. In fact, shortly after the filming of this, it burned entirely. So this interior no longer exists in its original form. I believe it's been reconstructed, but this interior is reused with some different dressing for the notable scene prior to the intermission with Lord Lyndon having an attack whilst at the table. Strange. It is strange for Kubrick to do something like that because it is quite an identifiable interior. But yeah, there was economy in the use of some of these location shots.
But nevertheless, they're very impressive regardless, and it's always been something
Yeah.
that struck me with viewing any of Kubrick's Kubrick shots and interior decisions. And again, like I said, this little ode to Bellotto, which
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would have missed because, like I said, no such painting exists. It was invented for the film.
Strange.
And then,
Just
yeah,
I should mention it is I've just never thought about this before. The Bellotto painting and the view from the Belvedere. Just another cinema reference there, which I wonder if another favorite film of mine is The Silence of the Lambs. And there's a line that Hannibal Lecter delivers when he's showing his charcoal drawings, and he said, "This is the Duomo." Scene from the scene from the Belvedere, which of course ends up deep in the lore of that story is Lecter giving a clue, a very oblique clue to Agent Starling. But it is interesting, the view from the Belvedere sort of is this line. I wonder if they were directly referencing that picture.
now I might be confused here, but I'm not sure whether the Habsburg Palace in Florence is also called the Belvedere.
I don't think it is. I mean, I think that the idea was that, of course, Lecter was using because the killer who Jodie Foster's character is trying to catch
Mhm.
is from a town in Ohio called
Yeah,
Belvedere. So
yeah.
I think he was actually deliberately using something that, if she had known, she would know that there's no such situation, in Florence. So
Yes, again, that's a very sort of very niche reference, and I
yeah,
think.
sorry about that, but it just occurred to me anyway.
Well, no, I'm just sorry that I can't. I can't remember all the palace names in Florence off the top of my
Yeah,
head.
yeah.
To
No,
corroborate that.
neither. I should mention here, of course, the Chevalier. One interesting thing about about Barry Lyndon and Clockwork Orange and The Shining, all made it during the 1970s, is that Kubrick reuses quite a number of really familiar um, character actors. So, of course, the Chevalier is played by um, now of course the name is flown out of my head, is played by Patrick McGee here, who is also the writer in A Clockwork Orange. There's another actor called Philip Stone, who plays Bullingdon's assistant, who is in The Shining as Grady, the sinister butler figure. So it is interesting. Kubrick unusually sort of reuses some of these wonderful actors in several or three of those films. Sorry, not Halloran. The Lord Hallen that we meet later in Barry Lyndon is also famously the minister in Clockwork Orange. So it's nice to see these actors, Kubrick using these actors in very far-ranging roles.
In terms of this character in particular, there's a wonderful little a line which is offered as in terms of like advice in terms of the character he has to assume in the court of the Chevalier, which is, of course, he only has a smattering of French and a smattering of German, and of course, it's the language of the camp. You know, he's not being in refined circles, and Putzdorf is actually rather explicit in this, and again, it's something that speaks to the character in the book more so than the character in the film, which is that Putzdorf has an intention of elevating the young Redmond into a more exalted social circle. But of course, he can't pass as a Frenchman, and he can't pass as a German aristocrat, given the way he's essentially learnt those languages. So he is essentially to present himself as a Hungarian. And I find that interesting little connection between, you know, his Irish, you know, backdrop and Hungarian backdrop, because it's only someone that would appeal to me who has a little bit of Irish and a bit of Hungarian. That for some reason those two things would connect. That amused me on a personal level.
Oh, that's funny. And given, of course, the inscrutable, the absolute inscrutable nature of Hungarian. I mean, learning Hungarian is well, certainly for me, who I don't have a facility for language, but I like that they again chosen, let's sort of choose a nationality which no one will have any actual knowledge of this language, so he won't ever be asked to speak it.
It's the same in Pygmalion, actually. Interestingly enough.
Yeah, Hungarians.
But there's a major change from the book to the film, which is Redmond knows that Ballybarry is an imposter, not just because he's Irish, but because he is his uncle. He is Ballybarry, not de Ballybarry. He has this grand memorial, and again, is incumbent upon these gentlemen with these pretensions, these grand lineages, is that the Barry family has its own coat of arms. And of course, the coat of arms involving a little crown associated with the Irish kingdom is connected to the Chevalier in the book. And so he's easily identifiable. And so this huge wave, you can say, of familiarity is of that of a nephew to an uncle in that horrific situation. And so it's more understandable as to why we have this scene where he basically breaks down in front of the Chevalier. In the book, it makes complete sense.
It's a bit strange in the film. It is.
In the film, it really stretches the credulity because that relationship is not established. And as a result of that, the Chevalier sort of falls off later in the film, which he really never does in the book. And I was trying to ascertain what the reason to this. And you've already alluded to it earlier, Dee, which is this idea that, Kubrick wants to place Lyndon as this man who is this perpetual imposter, who is always out of his element. And so it's the finding any form of a kindred spirit in a foreign land. And this is from that same interview with Michel Clément, which I mentioned earlier. Barry Lyndon is a story which does not depend on surprise. What is important is not what is going to happen, but how it will happen. I think Thackeray trades off the advantage of surprise to gain a greater sense of inevitability and a better integration of what might otherwise seem melodramatic or contrived. In the scene you refer to where Barry meets the Chevalier, the film's voiceover establishes the necessary groundwork for the important new relationship, which is rapidly to develop between the two men. by talking about Barry's loneliness being so far from home, his sense of isolation as an exile, and his joy at meeting a fellow countryman in a foreign land. The commentary prepares the way for the scenes which are quickly to follow, showing his close attachment to the Chevalier. So he's basically admitting that the narrator is needed to justify
Mm,
this dramatic about turn and his willingness basically to completely break from his spy mission and fall on the mercy of this complete stranger. When in the book, it's very well established, and I think this also speaks to a very controversial element in terms of those things which are not alluded to in the film, which I think are very, very important, which is the religious aspect. Because despite being an imposter, like Redmond, de Balibari is that sort of that Catholic link to the family. He's a genuinely sort of religious man.
mm,
Um, During the book, there are many references of him becoming, more, religious at various times, despite him being a cheater and a prolific gambler, as part of the quote unquote firm he'll establish with his nephew. And so him being, the disgraced and, cast off uncle, who essentially lost his relationship to his brother when that was that, when the abjuration happened and the Barry family changed their religion. That is an important connection in terms of him actually representing part of the old Irish aristocracy, of which Redmond can appeal to. But of course, removing the familial aspect also removes that connection to the older Barry family and so much of the dynastic and gentlemanly elements. So I think you could almost say that it was incumbent on Kubrick, if he had no interest in showing those elements, those more regal elements of the Barry family and their claims to such exalted stations, that as a result he had to be made approachable in the sense that he was just a countryman, but distant in the way that there was no sort of deeper connection that could evolve apart from, again, their mutual self-interest, which emerges as a result of this relationship. So I think a very controversial change from the book.
yeah, and it is also always strikes me as strange that the Chevalier just disappears in the film. In the narrative, he's just sort of not there, and it's never really kind of explained, other than what Redmond has to do. But again, he's Kubrick has turned Redmond into a sort of completely disconnected cipher, in a way, and you can feel it. I mean, he removes these very important connections. I mean, the scene is, it's, as you say, I think it's slightly stretches credulity. I mean, the narrator, of course, he says he's so struck by the splendor of the Chevalier's appearance, that he just starts to weep, and other than this, again, this slightly prejudicial idea, which has some currency of the Irish being overly emotional, or sort of over the or sort of the inability to regulate outbursts of emotion, or maybe a sort of association with again with Catholicism. I don't know, but it's a very odd thing, and I do think that certain choices that Kubrick made um, render some of these things a bit inscrutable.
I mean, the religious aspect to me again
Yeah.
is key in terms of unlocking the character, and
Well,
yeah,
there's a very brief little nod to that, because of course during one of Barry's reports, Redmond's reports to Potts Pottsdorf, he says he's a very religious man, and about the Chevalier. But of course in the film you regard that as being a kind of joke, because of
yes, it's
course
very cynical.
it's like a cynical thing. That's just Barry again giving some misdirection. But of course, with absent that, I think, very important aspect of the character, Kubrick sort of discards. I mean, it's a problem with sort of the adaptation. A lot of the complexity of the novel is going to be difficult to kind of include in a film. But I feel like some of these things would have perhaps given a little more sort of, I don't know, weight to
Well,
some of the things that happen.
well, they're very subtle allusions to it. I mean, the reason why Redmond in the book infers that it's sincere is all of these references constantly to the Virgin Mary, which are brought up by the Chevalier. And again, that subtle reference completely gone. And in terms of that passage you mentioned, this is so much of the dialogue, as I mentioned, in the screenplay is just lifted completely from the book, including the element where he was regaling Pottsdorf all of this information to the most minute detail, but nothing of any real importance. There were banal details meant to confound the police informant rather than anything, while he was again completely associated with the Chevalier. And of course, from the book, we understand as to why. But it leads to the situation where they establish a system to cheat at cards, cheat at the game, where all of these, of course, he's just a waiter. He is to give no impression that he speaks any of the languages, essentially, in order to present himself as dumb, stupid, and aloof. But nevertheless, he's watching the cards and he's giving the Chevalier subtle nods without making it obvious that he's cheating. The impression and the justification they also use is that everyone else cheats. So this is simply the aristocratic pastime, simply finding more ingenious ways of being able to avoid essentially being found, essentially being proved, having proof shown that you're cheating. But at least this, yeah.
But maybe one of the sort of slight weaknesses in Kubrick's overall, sort of character is that, I mean, there is no God in any Kubrick. I mean, the closest we get to God in a Kubrick film is in 2001. The closest we get to the idea of any transcendence, because as far as I can remember, maybe in Paths of Glory in the early films, but in Kubrick's later work, there is no transcendence ever. And of course, it's an entirely cynical understanding of human nature. There are almost no good characters. There's almost no character who is not somehow culpable for their own sort of misbehaviors and sins in any Kubrick film. So perhaps his sort of insensitivity to this to these more important things was part of his own perhaps cynical or sort of atheistic understanding of the world.
It's very possible. What happens from here on out is that there is one Prince Tübingen who is a relative of the great Frederick, and he is convinced he's being cheated at cards and challenges the Chevalier and he demands satisfaction. But rather than allow this to become a major diplomatic incident, because he's connected with the Austrian embassy, a scheme is essentially allowed for both of them to flee the country and flee the Prussian police ministry, where the real Chevalier retreats into Saxony the night before, and Redmond presents himself as the Chevalier in order to be deported by the by the Prussian police.
Imposter pretending to be another imposter, which is sort of interesting. Yeah,
exactly. And this begins, you can say, their new life together as creating the firm, which is the basis of the play, where they go around all of these aristocratic courts. They begin in Saxony, which of course isn't really Saxony. It's actually the Castle Hohenzollern in southern Germany, and it's from this that you have all of these sort of very famous shots and images and candlelit scenes regarding the play. And of course, the whole basis is that, as we see with Casanova, they're able to make a vast amount of money from this gambling outfit, carousing throughout Europe. They accept promissory notes, and their reputation essentially is to allow for all of these, aristocrats to partake as much as possible, to the point that, of course, if they default on their debts, they demand satisfaction. And, Redmond, being the great swordsman that he is, will invariably always win. And this is a point of view from the book as well, which comes across very uncritically in a way in the film. In the book, Redmond presents himself as always winning. And that impression is carried over into the film when there is, in fact, an editor's note by Thackeray to say that this is most definitely a lie by the unreliable narrator.
Mm.
So it's very possible again that he may have, as we see with that little description I gave about those holes being punctured in all of the aristocracy of Europe, that he may have been dealt quite a few severe blows and losses as a result of that. And indeed, you have a lot more detail in the book going over the fact that there is a third member of their firm who robs them after essentially demanding that he receive a higher, proportion of the payment. And so, despite again these grand pretensions and the Chevalier's preposterous appearance, as we saw, and his powdered wig and his fake mole and all that sort of thing, they're based, and the whole notion that he was so refined and glorious in his appearance that he would cause the young Redmond to weep in front of him, as if seeing the face of God or whatever. They're penniless. Effectively, they're all imposters. It's all for show, and they get involved in a series of very sort of high risk, high stakes activities. In the film, these are actually very, very much limited. You don't get the impression of the high stakes they're really involved in. In the book, you have a grand affair with an emerald, which is an allusion to the jeweled necklace scandal involving the Cardinal de Rohan and Marie Antoinette. But perhaps what's the most controversial element in terms of the adaptation is that a major part of the book is simply removed, which is the first great marriage ploy by Redmond Barry to marry a Princess Olivia, who is based on the real life Duchess Auguste Caroline of Brunswick Wolfenbüttel. They go to this Duchy of Aix. They become enamored of the great sort of patron of the arts, the great Duke and the Duke to be, and as a result of this, the grand adventure, they ended up exiled from the Duchy of Aix and essentially have to find a new marriage scheme. But the point is, the whole marriage plot and the whole using again the firm and the aristocratic connections to rob, steal, cheat, use any form of artifice and ploy to advance their station, despite again the chevalier's Catholic pretensions, they will stoop basically to nothing in order to advance their position. All of that is eliminated in order to focus on the relationship in part two. And you were talking about those earlier images and a series of paintings. Well, this is the etching version by Hogarth of A Rake's Progress and the orgy and the gaming house. And looking at some of these scenes, of course, these are far more raucous by comparison.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I couldn't help feel that these were an obvious inspiration.
Yeah, yes, certainly. Yeah. I mean, as for the first marriage plot, I can absolutely see why it was excised. It just it was very difficult to do in a film to have, because of course for the entire second part of the film to play out as it does, you would almost be repeating a similar thing, and I can see why in an already quite long film, why that would have been just extra, just a lot of extra things that plot devices and characters that you'd have to sort of deal with, and I could see why that was expunged. I mean, other decisions I'm not so sure about, as we've mentioned, but that I could certainly see. I mean, obviously you're losing this and you're losing context and richness, but I think I think it would have been very difficult for Kubrick to have made any sense of that in the context of this film.
Yes, I do agree. What I think is lost, however, is the whole basis of the relationship essentially with Lady Lyndon as being far closer to what I mentioned earlier with Stony Bows,
Mm,
that it was a scheme, a great sort of a grandiose scheme that had been attempted before and failed dramatically and ended
right.
off with an aristocratic exile. Because as a result of that, the entire relationship is fundamentally different. You already sort of alluded to Sir Charles. There's also a funny little reference. This is Chaplain Runt, this little figure on the left who coincidentally fits his name rather well. Kubrick has no illusions. His Runt is in love, very obviously,
Yeah.
with the Countess, but nevertheless, him being a very overly sort of prim and proper and repressed Anglican chaplain, would never ever sort of make those claims. But nevertheless, she is married to her cousin, Sir Charles Lyndon, and actually, from the book, it's made more extreme. In the book, he's only 50. In the film, he looks as if he's 70 and, very close to death. And again, the relationship is somewhat recontextualized in the sense that Barry, of course, not in any way being in love with Lyndon or Lady Lyndon, actually enjoys Sir Charles quite a lot as a gambling partner, as a great sort of devotee of the firm that he and the Chevalier have set up in Spa, which is a resort town in Belgium, which was then the Austrian Netherlands. So a lot of the context has changed, and I think it's part of the whole sort of laissez-faire, the sort of sort of easy style of these aristocrats that they don't really care. They don't. There isn't a sort of grasping or sort of burning desire to see him dead and to take over and consummate this relationship of love, which of course it comes across, from her at least, in the film. And I just want to read what Kubrick wrote about this because this is a very significant departure and change in the character. I think that silent films got a lot more things right than talkies. Barry and Lady Lyndon sitting at the gambling table and exchanging lingering looks. They do not say a word. Lady Lyndon goes on the balcony for some air. Barry follows her outside. They gaze longingly into each other's eyes and kiss. Still not a word is spoken. It's very romantic, but at the same time, I think it suggests the empty attraction they have for each other, that is, to disappear as quickly as it arose. It sets the stage for everything that is to follow in their relationship. The actors, the images, and the Schubert worked well together, I think. Berenson here, Marisa Berenson, is picked exclusively, you can almost say, to be this pin-up of the
Yeah.
aristocrat. You can basically see her again here. And I had sort of various inspirations in terms of the sort of artistic role she was supposed to sort of amass. And I have three different artists here. The one on the left is by one of the great feminine portrait artists of the Louis XV and sort of Louis XVI eras, Elizabeth Liberon, who also painted the famous portrait of Catherine de Bourlay, Talleyrand's mistress and later wife. Then we have the Gainsborough in the middle, and we have Joshua Reynolds in the right. And there's still a lot of debate at the time as to who was the superior portrait artist. Was it Gainsborough or was it Reynolds? But nevertheless, you can see in terms of her portrayal and the fact that she has so little in the way of dialogue or agency or
Yeah.
anything in the film, that this is the way essentially that Kubrick views her as that artistic amalgamation of all of these various influences coming into who would have been the real life Countess Strathmore, but is Linda Nora in the film.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's another. One of my favorite 18th century portrait artists was an English artist called George Romney, who also painted various ladies of the period.
Lady Hamilton, perhaps most
Yeah,
famously.
yeah, yeah. Yes, I think it's very interesting, of course, to think in terms of silent film because Kubrick. I mean, that is a reference, and it was a sort of great source of inspiration for him. And I remember watching an interview with Steven Spielberg, who was friends with Kubrick for many years, and he said that once he asked Kubrick, who do you think is the greatest actor? Who do you think is the greatest film actor? And Kubrick said, well, who do you think? And Spielberg listed a bunch of actors, certainly what I would consider narrative actors. And Kubrick said, well, my favorite actor is James Cagney, because of course James Cagney's acting was so much of his characterization was nothing to do with his presentation of dialogue. It was what he did with his body and what he did with his face. And so I think it certainly betrays Kubrick's interest in the idea that cinema is, conveys things that are not, that don't really require a kind of narrative presented in a traditional way. I mean, Barry Lyndon even uses sort of intertitles, famously, and throughout the film, almost as a silent film would do. But it is interesting that, of course, that Marissa Berenson is given almost nothing. I mean, almost all of her presence in the film is how she comports her body, how she models the clothing, the fashion, how she sort of stands in these interiors, and the subtle looks of her face. It's almost nothing is given to her in terms of dialogue. So yeah, interesting to think about.
I think one travesty that I think Kubrick couldn't allow is the fact that in the Thackeray novel, she gains a huge amount of weight during the course of their married life, and of course, she undergoes her wig grays a little bit, her hair grays a little bit, but apart from that, there's no illusion whatsoever that she has gained any weight, or sort of that there's only sort of been a withering. There hasn't been a sort of an element of the grotesque added to her character, which is very much obvious when it comes to the betrayal in the book.
Well, that and interesting, of course, this film is so deliberately paced, and with Kubrick's obsession with kind of symmetry and very subtle camera movements. Many of the movements in the film are not even really camera movements; they're optical movements, because there are many very slow zooms, zoom in and zoom out, rather than explicit camera movement. And so when there are deviations from that, of course, it's very violently noticeable. And of course, one of those scenes is when in the film, when Lady Lyndon poisons herself, and there's a scene, and the camera, of course, one of the very few times in the film where the camera is handheld, and it's very off-kilter and very off-putting. I think that would be probably the closest that we get to seeing this character sort of approach the kind of horrific or grotesque, or that there's some aspect of her, as this perfect kind of model of this Georgian, this Georgian woman of station, sort of breaking the character.
So, as Kubrick alludes to, his intention was to make it a superficial love match.
Yeah.
The idea that they're married, they're basically in love within the first sort of 6 hours of knowing each other, equivalent to love at first sight. And then there is the intention, the burning desire by Redmond to see the man dead. And of course, he dies very dramatically in that scene, basically saying, do you think you're the first of any of the suitors, lined up in order to replace me, etc.
It's wonderful. That scene. Another one of those scenes that's, I mean, again, it's sort of, it's faintly ridiculous and faintly grotesque. I mean, the character of Lord Lyndon, he's like, I'd rather be known as a cuckold than a fool, and then he has that very dramatic moment. Makes a sort of horrible sound.
Yes, was it? I'm sorry for you. I'm grieved to keep you or any gentleman waiting. Had you not better to arrange with my doctor, or get the cook to flavour my omelette with arsenic? What are the odds, gentlemen?
Yeah, what are the odds that I will live to see Redmond Bury hang yet? Yeah, it's really wonderful, that bit, and certainly a wonderful way to end the first. Well, it's not really the first act, but the first half of the film.
So, sort of moving forward, really, we have the death, we have the quote unquote inconsolable widow, and they marry very, very quickly. I want to reference the marriage scene here. It very much reminded me of, you can say, three contrasting images by Hogarth. The one in particular in the middle is that of the rake's marriage to the spinster. Again, in the book, she is much older than Redmond, and it's very clear again that his primary conceit is not her beauty, but her money and her title. And then we have this very arduous sermon by Chaplain Brunt, talking about marriage, which was instituted, of course, to forestall any attempts at fornication. And it reminded me of this image we have on the right, which is the sleeping parishioners. So I thought it was the perfect amalgamation of these three paintings by the same artist, but all having very sort of different sort of implications as a result of them.
Indeed, there's a very subtle bit in the way that the way that Reverend Runt is filmed. So when he is delivering the harsh rebuke, he's looking towards Redmond, and then there's a very subtle thing where he turns the page, and then his eyes are cast towards Lady Lyndon, and then his tone very subtly softens, but reverently, discreetly, and in fear of God. Like, so it's again another clue that Reverend Runt is, of course, madly in love with Lady Lyndon. But so yeah. So one of the interiors that I immediately recognize. This is a chapel at Petworth House, by the way, where this was filmed. But yeah, a wonderful scene. A great example, of course, of the light mentioned earlier, the lighting technique, where Kubrick, rather than place the film lights, in the scenes that were not by candlelight, the scenes during the day, rather than place any of the film lights in the interior, he placed very powerful lights right outside the window, and then put sort of diffuse fabric on the outside of the window to kind of soften the light. And this is a great example of that. I mean, this is artificial light, but it's a mixture of sunlight and artificial light, and of course, all coming from the window as the light would have, which of course gives it a much more painterly, sort of lighting in the interior. If you try to do a traditional film lighting in this interior, it's just going to look artificial. So it looks wonderful here because of that choice.
No, it is. It's a beautifully shot scene. I was thinking of including, more images, but alas, of course, the whole basis of their relationship is entirely changed in terms of the inspirations from Thackeray. The Stony Bow situation with the Countess Strathmore is that she is basically subjugated or tricked into marrying him. And that is the impression that comes across in the book. He begins, it should be noted, on the religious theme, obviously due to her relationship with the chaplain, which isn't so obviously put in terms of that unrequited love that he has for her. She is a bit of a theologian in her own right, and so he attempts to court her not by looking, lovingly across the table at each other, but by courting her views on transubstantiation.
Mm.
It begins with courting her views on transubstantiation. It ends up by stalking her, finding out wherever she goes, being there wherever she, leads in Europe, he will be there. He admits that he's basically going to cajole and terrify her into marrying. And worse than that, he is going to remove any obstacles or any potential suitors that potentially stand in the way. So it's a conquest. It's a complete and utter conquest, and it's relying again on her nervous, later will be referred to as her maudlin, weak personality in terms of his own reference and his own interpretation of her, to conquer her. But in this situation, it's entirely different. And I think, again, to present it as a more tragic fall of grace, because I think, again, Barry Lyndon for Stanley Kubrick is a tragedy, but I think in the case of Thackeray, it is a dark comedy.
Yeah.
There is a very distinct shift in tones between the book and the film.
Yeah, it's clear that Kubrick, his emotional investment in this is of a different nature. I mean, even given the kind of straying moments into kind of cynicism, but it's clear that, as I said earlier, that Kubrick had a great love and fondness for um, the 18th century in particular, and of course, whatever it may have been, the structure of aristocratic society, which of course would just fall apart. I mean, this is not only, of course, and the it's notable that the title of the second part after the intermission is, of the tragedies and disasters that befall Redmond Barry. So, of course, I mean, you again, as the narrator often gives away what's about to happen. I mean, prior to Redmond breaking down before the Chevalier, the narrator spoils it. He says, of it's the splendor of his appearance, and the outburst of emotion which is about to happen. And there's another, of course, tragic event that happens in the second part, which the narrator gives away prior to it ever happening. So it is interesting that it's almost as if that Redmond Barry is just sort of passively wandering through his ascension and his downfall, and that as he's sort of being railroaded in a way that he has no, in the film particularly, he just hasn't, as we've noticed, just has no agency. He's not occasionally a man of action. He's almost a man that has, as I said, just wandering and walking through life. It's interesting, of course. I forgot about that in the book also, the idea that he's going to consult with Lady Lyndon, because he refers to it in the film. In fact, in the scene with Lord Lyndon at the table, he says, I am consulting with Lady Lyndon in a religious matter of which she's a particular expert. And of course, Lord Lyndon laughs at that, and we read that as entirely cynical, which it may have been in the book as well. But I sort of forgot about that. There is reference to that. Reference to her, to be the first foray being this sort of theological one, and then of course the madness of I'm going to just then.
Well, as with so much of the
threaten her into it.
dialogue, the context is entirely different because the sincerity from the religious angle would have been clearly from her, whereas in the film it's obvious that there is no sincerity from either of them. They're in love with each other, and it is purely a pretense. And I think in terms of the massive changes in the character and the passivity of him and the lack of agency, the issue is here that now he's arrived at this peak of success where he's married into the nobility, not a noble himself, but married into the nobility, and has a vast estate to manage now, is that he becomes the character from the book. And as we saw earlier with him breaking before the Chevalier, which seemed, rather contrived and inexplicable, this is equally inexplicable. We have this moment where he says, I had not arrived at the pitch of prosperity, and having at 30 years of age, by my own merits and energy, raised myself to one of the highest social positions that of any man in England could occupy, I determined to enjoy myself as becomes a man of equality of the remainder of my life. And again, that is not the sort of statement you would imagine coming from the character that we've come to recognize. You have the occasional moments before this alluding to the fact that I'm not a fool when it comes to love. I after the whole Nora fiasco, he was accustomed to have a far more transactional nature when it comes to his marriage prospects, and he sees Linda Nora as an aspect of that. But it's very clear that he's also at first in love with her and attracted to her great beauty. So seeing that is the sort of declaration you would have after a marriage which is purely contractual, purely for the pursuit of personal gain. And as a result of that, the subsequent sort of decline of the character is quite jarring. And again, as you mentioned with the various Hogarth sort of painting scenes, this is tete-a-tete, a painting which Kubrick, I think, referenced directly as having a sort of remarkable inspiration. You see the bottles, the turned out furniture, the waste straw, the man looking exhausted, drunk, sort of broken, the whole, and then of course we have the toilette, which is another sort of repeated sort of visual representation we have from Berenson. So as I mentioned, that it becomes in many ways less of an adaptation of the book and more of an adaptation of these paintings that we see, and the relationship seems to be presented in that way. And the addition, of course, is to the drama comes from Viscount Bullingdon, the stepson, and he's a very different character. It should be mentioned again in the book compared to in the film. In the film, he's a really rather pathetic little creature. I mean, I thought watching it at first that he was a wannabe Hamlet, And of course, reading the book, that's the explicit association. The character was intended to be a Hamlet, seeing himself essentially as being, robbed of the king. And now we have, Claudius taking over and usurping his estate and usurping his throne. So from the outset, from the book, it's very clear that, Bullingdon has made a declaration of war. He does receive the beating. And there is that little, reference to, I've never beaten a lord before. When caning the Viscount for his disobedience towards his stepfather. But nevertheless, Bullingdon goes off in the book to actually lead that regiment that Barry had essentially raised himself in order to curry favor for his peerage campaign from the king. And there were many rumors that the Viscount Bullingdon had died heroically in the American War of Independence, the Revolutionary War. So a very different character compared to that sopping, almost Oedipus-esque sort of character that we see with those massive lips that we just
clinging like a mollusk to his mother.
I mean, there's like a mollusk to his mother. Yeah,
there's a wonderful scene where for the I can't remember. Is it a magician? It's like a conjurer. I think, but he's again at that point. Of course, it's Leon Vitali, the actor who played the older Bullingdon, sitting on the grass, clinging at his mother's leg, and it's just something really sort of unpleasant about the nature of his character. So yes, he's a much more sniveling, miserable character. Leon Vitali, of course, the actor who played Bullingdon, the older Bullingdon. Went on to become Kubrick's, basically his right-hand man for the rest of Kubrick's life. He worked with him on every subsequent film. He often served as the casting director. It was Leon Vitali who picked Danny Lloyd out of 10,000 American children who'd auditioned for the character of the boy in The Shining. And he of course helped as assistant to the actors, assistant to Kubrick, and then after Kubrick's death, he was responsible for the kind of remastering and higher res transfers of Kubrick's films. So he's passed away a few years ago, but yeah, really interesting guy. But of course, the perfect kind of slightly grotesque face that was. That gave the character in the film its sort of his sort of slug-like demeanor. Also notably appears as an actor in Eyes Wide Shut. So if you recall the orgy scene where everyone was wearing the Venetian masks, and there's a figure in red who is leading the ceremony. That's Leon Vitali, who, of course, there's a whole thing where he's like, remove your clothes, or would you like us to do it for you? Yeah, that's him. So,
well, I was just about to refer to the fact that the duck lips have a different connotation these days, but there we are.
Oh, God.
But anyway, we then have this famous statement that it's incumbent again on the Lady Lyndon to give comfort and dressing and educating the children, but she should give up pleasures and frivolities of the world. So she left that part of the duty of every family of distinction to be performed by me. And again, directly lifted from the book, completely in character for the book Redmond, but completely, I would say, jarring to have this sudden sort of character eruption. And again, even the Barry Lyndon, like I said, it's a direct association with Stony Bows, combining the two great families to create his own dynasty. And just this little scene, which is, you can say, the emphasis of the plot, which is the hunt for the peerage, him talking with his very ambitious mother. Another sort of little sort of artistic references, Jean Watteau and Gainsborough again, these talks in the garden. This image in particular on the right, I found very interesting because you have all of these walks next to Palladian bridges, and a large part of the sort of architectural, like the Castle Howard, is an 18th century sort of English Baroque castle, so everything is time appropriate. That the first sort of revelation of an affair with one of the maids, and added to many of the other inconveniences for the lady is jealousy, according to the film. It's alluded to by essentially this view you can see through the trees. It's slowly revealed, and of course you have the young Viscount Bullingdon, of course, witnessing his stepfather's infidelities, and being shamed as a result of that, and the whole estate and the family being shamed as a result of that. So again, little artistic references in terms of the landscapes and the beauty shots. But as for the plot, I mentioned earlier the fact that being a gentleman was actually something rather niche in British society at that point. And by that I mean English, Scottish, and Irish. There were only roughly around 20,000 gentlemen, but nevertheless they couldn't claim to have any sort of title or any style or affectation. And to be a peer of the realm, unlike what we saw in Europe, where there is, so much in the way of royalty and nobility. I mean, there were more, if I recall, I might be wrong, princes of the blood in Germany than there were peerages in England. Um, and of course, Barry, with all of his grand pretensions, believed himself to be, a prince of the blood, even though it was, as we mentioned too, faintly preposterous. But having the stamp of a peerage would have given him the ability essentially to form his dynasty in his own right, because as things currently stand, the estate would be inherited by Viscount Bullingdon very explicitly within the film, and in the books there's the Tiptoft conspiracy. And we see, you can say, all of the worst vices of aristocratic society, that all of these nobles would stoop to receive bribes from the young Barry, who the young Redmond, who basically pensions off the entire estate in order to begin this grand campaign for the peerage. He woos, in particular, one Earl Gustavus Adolphus, who accepts these sort of candidates for the peerage. And what I find so remarkable about watching this is that it's such an intensive, such an expensive, and ultimately such a futile affair. And rewatching this at a time where the House of Lords has basically been stripped away and removed, and having all of the hereditary peerages essentially gone, is all the more stark to imagine that it was such a costly and ruinous endeavor that we saw at this time. And another little allusion to to the estate is not just the fact that he was campaigning for the period, but just the fact that he would spend everything conspicuously and lavish all these entertainments and luxuries on any occasion. Again, consistent with the character that we see in the book, that it's incumbent upon an aristocrat. And of course, in the book, there is that element that he is especially good to his patrons within Ireland. The noblesse oblige of the Irish nobility, refashioning Castle Lyndon as this great sort of noble outpost for the Barry dynasty. And another very important connection between Barry and the Lyndon estate, which this is why I think cutting out all the dynastic elements in the book does a disservice to the character so much, is that the Barrys have long memories. They are looking back to not only King Brian Boru, but they are looking back to the lands and holdings which they believed to be theirs. They believed that the lands of the Barry dynasty had been usurped by the Elizabethan adventurers in the late 16th century. And the Lyndon estate was one of these Elizabethan adventurers who had dispossessed the Barrys of their estates. And so when he was marrying Lyndonora, he was actually, from his point of view, undoing a great injustice that had been done to his estate. So this whole dynastic conception of his is so key to his character, and it sort of oozes out with each one of his actions. And of course, in terms of the folly and the tragedy, he laments to himself that it was not for me to finish my life as a man of quality and position. Indeed, I am one of those born clever enough gaining a fortune, but incapable of keeping one, for the qualities and energy which lead a man to accept the first are often the very causes of his ruin in the later court case. Indeed, I know of no other person than no other reason for the misfortunes which finally befell me. And again, it's from the point of view of Kubrick's point of view, it's to present it almost explicitly as a tragedy, but remove those dynastic conceptions and the huge amount of animus he had for the Lyndon family. And I think quite a lot is lost. But of course, his peerage pursuit is doomed to failure.
Yep.
And it comes across in this very famous scene where we have the recital at Castle Howard. And again, another moment which is lifted from the book, which is the young Brian, wearing the Viscount shoes and coming in very sort of ostentatiously and delivering this denunciation of his stepfather in front of all these assembled throngs who were there to support Redmond's peerage. And how does Redmond react? Not very well. Would you like to explain how he reacts to this situation?
Well, of course, yeah, and perhaps drawing on stereotypes of the Irish being, sort of emotionally incontinent, he, of course, just leaps out of his chair and just begins to pummel Viscount Bullingdon. And of course, it's another one of those moments where it's a violent sort of it's a violent deviation from the way that this film is mostly presented the world. There's symmetry and order, and composition and sort of balance and all of this. And of course, suddenly it's another one of those moments where Kubrick uses the handheld camera, and it's a way you'd never expect, to see all of these gracious lords and ladies, the height of fashion and top of society. You would never see, they're not. Even Hogarth's scenes of sort of chaos and degradation, they're still, Hogarth couldn't have imagined, tilting the frame, and the sort of conventions that became common after the invention of photography, the understanding that the camera lens, of course, can be manipulated in ways that you would never think of the human, a human sort of view of a scene to be similarly kind of disrupted. So, of course, Kubrick uses that to great advantage, and the chaos in this scene, contrasted with, the stately nature of the music and the coiffure of the guests is it gives the scene a wonderful kind of quality to it. But yes, of course, Redmond reveals himself, of course, to be the imposter, to being the brute, leaving aside the idea that, of course, any one of these people obviously have their own secrets, have their own sort of forays into brutishness and chaos, but it is, of course, Redmond who reveals himself to be the beast, hiding in fine clothes, and then he becomes, of course, in the film, a pariah because of this outburst. So
yes, this is the inciting incident. He is revealed. Again, it's not so much a matter that he is the beast; it's a matter that he was caught.
Yeah, yes, exactly. That he was unable to sort of keep it under wraps.
And this provides the impetus for all of his aristocratic backers to turn on him because he is this pariah. He's seen as a liability. There's this scene with Gustavus Adolphus where he refuses all the invitations, having once again accepted vast amounts of bribes in order to press his claim towards the king. Even as we mentioned, raising a regiment to fight in the American Revolutionary Wars. All of the promissory notes, are coming back to him. All the debts are being exacted. In the book, it's far more severe because the Tiptoff conspiracy, the relatives of the Countess are all coming back and demanding that he lose financial control of the estate, because essentially it is seen that he is usurping it. I mean, even when it comes to little things like cutting down trees and things like that. But from the film's point of view, that element essentially is gone. The great sort of impetus for his own self-aggrandizement, the hunt for the peerage, is over, and it then focuses on the tragedy of young Brian. You had this earlier scene where, rather ridiculous scene, where Runt is acting as tutor to both of them. They're both sort of taking their own sort of respective studies, and then Brian keeps annoying the Viscount, and then the Viscount just sort of goes into the stupor and starts smacking his bottom, rather sort of preposterously, and then that again is another inciting incident that sets up this whole scenario to begin in the first place. But up until now, we don't really have any sort of impression from Brian, but the point is explicit. It's told to us before it's happened that my tragedy is to have none of my progeny succeed me, and for me to die, alone and penniless, impoverished. And so one of the redeeming elements about Redmond is his complete slavish devotion and love of his son. No expense is spared. You refer to the party with the magician and things, and the wonderful little carts with the plumed sheep and all
the
that
sheep,
sort of thing.
Which Kubrick, of course, uses to disastrous emotional effect later on.
Oh yes, what essentially happens is that the boy has a pony. He wants nothing more than to join his father on the hunt, and so wants a horse. It's his 10th birthday, and again, the detail for the horse is that he's very difficult to tame, and he would have to be broken in order to be effectively ridden, and not a safety risk for his son. But of course, the son can't wait until his birthday, and so gets on the horse and ends up being involved in this horrific accident that will eventually kill him. And in this situation, essentially, it's one of these sort of last moments of humanity and connection between the Countess and Redmond, in that the young, again, would-be king, Brian, implores them that they stop fighting in order to meet with him in heaven. And it's a very, very moving scene, and I cried the first time watching it. And of course, in terms of the tragic effect, you reference the little plume sheep, and of course it's the plume sheep that will be carrying the little coffin.
Pulling
the
funeral
pulling the coffin, the funeral coffin towards for the young Brian. And essentially that is, for the point of view of the Countess, that is the final sort of nail in the proverbial coffin. It causes her to become what the film essentially refers to as driven to distraction, i.e., depression, melancholy. And of course, she tries to kill herself. She takes great consolation in the chaplain, and later that's used by Mrs. Barry as an attempt essentially to control and remove any sort of pillars of support that she can have and connect with the outside world. And the great inciting incident for the rest of the plot is the suicide attempt, which brings the young Viscount Bullingdon out from his exile to return and demand satisfaction. Now, this is all invented. In the book, it's a much sort of broader conspiracy involving the Countess Lyndon, with a lot more agency in terms of trying to bring out her own husband's demise and involving her relatives. And Bullingdon's only brought in much later, after essentially the plot of the story has been completed. But in this, it's very clear that there is a bit of, again, a cyclical element to this tragedy. It begins with his father's death at the hand of death in a duel. His whole adventure, his grand tour, begins with the farce of the duel to begin with, where he essentially lost everything and had to become a soldier of fortune. And now it ends with, again, the young Hamlet, the Viscount Bullingdon, essentially trying to conquer his estates again, in an almost very literal sense of placing his stepfather in a trial by combat as basically the only way he can resume control of his estates. And so the ending of the film versus the book is far more dramatic in this sense, and I would actually argue it's an improvement. It's an improvement of of the film over the book. And I almost feel that the characterization of Bullingdon up to this point actually makes the turn more dramatic that he undergoes a great sort of character arc. You know, he had declared war from the beginning of that relationship, but he is, you know, a pathetic, doting, and cowardly creature. And in the end, you know, even despite again that moment of huge tension where he fires off the gun, you know, when he believed it was getting cocked, and vomits, believing that Redmond was going to kill him, and then Redmond doesn't shoot him. Of course, this is invented by Kubrick, and we can only interpret again, you know, why he did that. But my interpretation has always been that everyone believed that Redmond wanted to murder Bullingdon because Bullingdon was the main obstacle towards the inheritance of the estates. But now he was in a situation where he had no heir, so you know Brian couldn't fulfill those shoes anymore, and that everyone already believed him being the pariah, that he wanted to murder the Viscount anyway, and so he essentially had nothing to gain other than confirming all of the horrible, you know, accusations and suspicions of all of those people who now believe him to be a pariah if we end up killing Viscount Bullingdon, and very little to gain. So essentially bargains for his life by refusing to kill him. And of course, the Viscount doesn't stand by that. He still has to get him out of the way. And he ends up shooting him in the leg. And and that eventually involves the leg being amputated towards the end. And whilst he is incapacitated, he and the accountant and the whole sort of managers of the estate support him and get him involved in a conspiracy to force him into exile, being bought off with a tiny pension. And there's a moment in the final few scenes in the film where it seems that the Countess is regretful. You know, there's still an aspect of love that's shown in terms of her signing off the what was it, the 500 guineas a year in order to support his exile abroad and his gambling with far less success. So all these elements of tragedy are compounded in terms of this conclusion, and therefore I think it's actually very effective. You know, whatever shortcomings in terms of the character development that the film hadn't to this point, I think it's brought to bear quite successfully here. Um, of course, the contrast is that the Countess in the book, you know, outright hates him, is associated with all of those horrible implications we have with the Stony Bows connection of her being controlled, abducted, her letters being intercepted, all of that sort of thing. So the film again goes out of its way to portray their relationship as far more sincere and Redmond in a far more tragic light.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's particularly effective because, of course, you know, I mean, in the final scene, you know, her beauty is gone. You know, she looks haggard and haunted in a way, and you know, and of course, it becomes Bullingdon as the eternal kind of parasite. You know, feeding her just the you know all the writs and and you know sort of payments that she's there just to sign things, you know, in the end. So her station has really kind of not changed or even gotten worse because you know she has nothing other than as the kind of wielder of the pen. uh and also particularly that Kubrick chose, I mean, so the interior that's filmed in, it's called the Double Cube Room, and it's at a place called Wilton House, and it's really one of the most famous, I would say, great house interiors in all of England. So, and it has a magnificent, giant painting by Anthony van Dyck. In fact, there's a number of Van Dyck pictures, but that painting was actually painted for that interior. And so, if you ever get a chance to visit that room, but I mean, Kubrick using that room, absolutely over the top grandeur of that room for this sort of final scene is, I think, part of its emotional, you know, impact. And this is, of course, the great use of Schubert's piano trio, and he uh, used to great effect, even if incongruous with the period of the film.
I don't know. I think it's appropriate here because if we're talking about, you know, the Romantic Age, it is also the beginning at the end of an age. Yeah, this is taking place what in like 17 1983. Just a couple of years before the French Revolution. The American Revolution has already taken place. The great aristocratic revolution has already occurred, and it's simply a matter of the aristocracy undergoing this. Well, from the point of view of what would be considered fashionable society in the 18th century, that society will fade very dramatically over the course of the Revolutionary Wars and post-Napoleon. Obviously, the story begins with a duel and ends with a duel. But when Thackeray was writing this, the era of the great era of dueling aristocrats was over. So, in terms of it actually representing a transitional period piece from classical to romantic, I think if there is a usage that could be justified for Schubert, I think it's there. And as you mentioned, it's used very effectively. I just want to respond to this comment. That's not my reasoning. I don't like things just being longer for the sake of it. Interestingly enough, I think you can actually probably add a lot more dialogue to this film and not have to actually lengthen it due to how again pregnant many of the scenes are, and how much so much is focused on the visual splendor of it, as was referenced at the beginning, as opposed to the dialogue. I believe you can actually add a lot more dialogue and not have to necessarily increase the length of the film. That's not my issue. My issue has basically been that Barry Lyndon is a very active and interesting, complicated, and you can almost say at the end, a very reactionary and tragic character. But Kubrick is only able to get bits and pieces there that seem rather incongruous. And so, how I sort of view it from as a historian is to refer back to, I believe it was the quote by Walter Coppedge, "The Elegy of an Age," that there's a huge amount of nostalgia that's born out of this. What became the great era of the aristocrat instead sort of made way for this greater ennui, this boredom and this nervous trepidation that ensued from the collapse of a social order that came before it. And I think he gets that across very well in terms of all the grandeur, but also the vices of that era. Displayed to such a comic exaggeration as they are. You can interpret this in many ways as a dark comedy, and I think you can interpret the novel as a dark comedy, and I think both of them have their tragic elements as well. So, thank you everyone for listening. I guess this is the one shot that we haven't actually talked about, which is the shot where satisfaction is demanded by the young Viscount Bullingdon, which is also the thumbnail for this stream.
Yeah, and which, of course, the pose is very much inspired by that from Marriage a la Mode, by the Lord collapsed in his chair whilst his there we go. So clearly Kubrick was playing off that. If you go back to that to the opening, the title, there is, I don't know. I don't know if that's. I think it may be another man in the same scene, but the cinematographer who shot this film, who also shot The Shining, John Alcott, appears as a passed-out drunken man. I don't think that's him to the right of Ryan O'Neill, but I think he may be in another part of this house. When Bullingdon walks in, there's another man sort of asleep in a chair, and that may be Alcott. But interesting that Kubrick gave the cinematographer a cameo, which doesn't happen in any other Kubrick film. So certainly a shout out to Alcott's genius work, realizing this, helping Kubrick realize this vision with in photography. Also, I think it's notable that I can't remember which house this interior is in, but again, they perhaps gave Kubrick more leeway to alter these historic interiors than they would now. I mean, they would never let people burn candles in some of these rooms, and here they raised the height of all the portraits. So, in fact, you can see the discoloration on the wall where those paintings had been hanging for for a very long time, and Kubrick raised them up for compositional purposes, probably to so that the sort of impact of this composition was not sort of diluted by having those portraits being quite visible. But yeah. Um,
Well, in
but
this
wonderful scene,
particular,
and of course, I mean, and of course, Bullingdon's obviously scared out of his mind whilst doing this. I mean, you know, this, which you know, in another situation could be interpreted as Bullingdon, the heroic act of demanding satisfaction. You know, he's scared out of his mind. He's out of his element here.
I think perhaps it would have made the scene, maybe this is just too obvious, but as I've been at pains to say, so much of the book character is given over without the needed context to establish him. So we understand from reading the book why Redmond is as proud and confident and fanatical as he is in that first duel. But I think again, just from a movie drama logic, it would have been better to change that slightly and present him more like we see with Viscount Bullingdon, more, scared for the fact that he is in that position where he's going to be potentially killed by Captain Quinn. Instead, it's Captain Quinn who is quivering and shaking and terrifying. Redmond is never, I don't think Redmond is ever really scared at all, with the exception of that moment where he breaks down, as we see from the point of view of the film, almost inexplicably, in terms of the glory and refinement of the Chevalier. So, but yes, I think the actor you reference, whose name escaped me now, played the role very, very well. Again, a major departure from the book, but I think it improved
Yeah.
over it in that regard. So, just a note on this painting, just something that doesn't really come across to me in the Hogarth. It actually reminded me a little bit of Vermeer in terms of the lighting. Yeah, maybe that's just me, but
No, no. I think. Yeah, I certainly see that, because I associate this very strong sort of daylight. You know, almost too white to be daylight. Light, yes, is very streaming through a window into an interior is very much something that. And of course, there may be something to that, because there's a very a somewhat credible theory, I think, promulgated partially by David Hockney, that Vermeer used what is called a camera obscura, which is basically a very simple device in which you reduce all the light coming into to a space, to a pinhole, and then you will of course see a projection, because of the light being sort of forced into what is essentially a small aperture lens. Then you can actually project that onto a surface, and you can actually sort of, it's almost like using a photographic reference. So there is some suggestion that Vermeer used this device, and which is one of the things that gives his paintings their kind of verisimilitude, for lack of a better word. So it's possible that that the association between that and this is again through the camera, an early manifestation of the camera. So it's sort of interesting.
well, thank you very much, Dee. We'll just get through the super chats and then get out of here. So, Sadila Bounty for 4.99. Thank you. As a fellow Irish rogue, Barry Lyndon is my favourite film. Good for you. We met at the 2024 event, and I forgot to tell you that you remind me of Reverend.
No,
Oh, God.
no.
Maybe I shouldn't have done the impression.
Yeah, perhaps, but no. You certainly have a far better physiognomy than Reverend Rund.
Well, I also happen to be about 2 feet taller than than Runt. So I don't think that's very flattering, especially if you've met me in person. uh, so Dear the Bounty again, for me, Barry Lyndon is connected to Parsifal and Schopenhauer's misogynistic outlook. Barry's revenge against love and snobbery are one and the same. Uh,
Mm.
yes, I get that impression more in the film than I do get that impression in the book. In the book, women are just a means to an end. I think it's much less a case that the Thackeray Redmond really loves Nora so much as that he's insulted by Quinn. In the film, it's obvious that he's very much in love with her. As tumultuous, horrific, and tragic as a unrequited first love can be. Um, so maybe that's an interpretation. It is a thought that occurred to me that he would take out all of his, you know, bitterness and frustrations due to his lack of success on someone like the Viscountess. Um, but the issue is that he was successful with women in the book, and that's portrayed essentially with the War Widow that we see, and the implication that he had many other affairs up until that point. And of course, in the book, is obvious that he's replete with all of his sexual conquests. So it's confused, I would say, in the film. That's not a interpretation that I believe is completely obvious. I think that it's more of an issue in failing to translate some of the ideas in terms of what the character represents from this, you know, cipher for the era with no agency to assuming all the characteristics as if he had agency all along. I think that's more of an issue there. But you can interpret that. I don't think it's entirely wrong to think that way. What do you think, Dee?
I don't know. I mean, the sense that the Barry Redmond Barry in the film is doing anything at all is, I mean, my feeling about him is that, as I said, he's sort of a almost strangely passive character. So, the to me, the idea of revenge seems even far too much, even far too much agency for him. But I don't know. Don't know.
Yes, I mean, the most obvious betrayal is the fact that he's prepared to basically, to put it bluntly, he's prepared to shag anything when he's married. Um, and I think the most obvious moment actually is, in terms of his disdain and lack of respect for her, is a moment which is completely lifted from the book, which is where he just blows smoke in her face in the carriage
In the
right
carriage.
after the wedding.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Um,
the first moment after the wedding that we see is him doing this, and so just completely reversing any idea that there's any sort of affection, really. Also, I forgot that. So there's the kind of orgy scene uh, in the film where you see, sort of topless, prostitutes and men sort of carousing and drinking, and they it's the sort of sad reprise of the British Grenadiers song, because that's what they're singing as Barry sort of snogs these slappers. So it's curious, maybe a bit of sardonic commentary there coming back.
Let those laugh that win, indeed. And I think, he has the, the character has conquered, and so he revels essentially in the spoils of victory. But yeah, Volpes 89 for £5. Thank you very much. Underrated character is the Reverend Runt, played expertly by Murray Melvin. He despises Barry, and I'm certain the man was obsessed with Lady Lyndon. Well, as we know from reading Kubrick's interviews, that was clearly Kubrick's intention. Runt has a very distinct role to play within the film that he doesn't within the books. And I think, based on that little element that Dee was referring to regarding the wedding, that very, very subtle implication of the look and the turning of the page and the glance he stares while sermonizing to the Lady Lyndon, I think it's very subtle and very effectively conveyed. And again, being the rather you know, pusillanimous and restrained character that he is, he only really sort of bursts out of his mold and begins to assert himself when he's told by Mrs. Barry to pack up his bags and leave, and that he's the reason why she's in this desolate state of distraction and religious turmoil towards the end. So the fact that he only breaks then at that point, I think is very consistent in terms of the way the character's played. I would actually argue that uh, I'm not a fan, I hate to say, of Ryan O'Neill's portrayal of Barry. It should have been obvious, I think, from what I've been saying throughout this. So I think Murray Melvin's. I think all of the performances really around are quite stellar. But Berenson, for example, she's very much intended, to be a model and nothing else, not really a character. She's really nothing more than an image, as we can see here. And Ryan O'Neill's character is, without agency. And how much you can blame that on Kubrick or the actor, I don't know. I'll leave that to Dee to discuss.
I don't have any further commentary. I mean, I will say that, of course, if you're familiar with Ryan O'Neill, the late Ryan O'Neill, his own life had a sort of Redmond Barry-esque trajectory. He sort of died in sad circumstances of penury and alcoholism and mental illness. So I don't know. I mean, compared to the other, I mean, if you think about the other great protagonists of Kubrick films, I mean, Keir Dullea in 2001, or Malcolm McDowell in Clockwork Orange, or
Well, I
whatever.
was just joking about the idea of Jack Nicholson being.
Oh, that would be something. But then, in a way, I always wonder if Kubrick chose Ryan O'Neill because he was so blank. I mean, he was a big name at the time. I can't remember some of the films that sort of launched him into, at that period of the 70s, into public consciousness. But I do wonder if part of Kubrick's decision there was to choose someone who was, in a way, kind of blank, kind of slightly blank. I don't know.
Yes, I think it's difficult to ascribe blame to the director or the actor.
Yeah, I don't think of. I mean, again, I don't think. I mean, of all of Kubrick's films, I don't think of Ryan O'Neill as. I don't think he's terrible, but I don't think I don't feel like it's a great performance, and I'm not sure that in the context of the way that the story is told in the film, that it would have been possible to deliver a great performance with the various limitations that Kubrick placed on the character in the adaptation. Difficult to say.
Well, I was even going to mention, because someone is mentioning it in the super chat, that Hardy Kruger as Pottsdorf, in that one scene, where he's essentially saying, that ridiculous, name of O'Brady, there's more sort of investment and character in that one moment than I think comes from Ryan O'Neill in the entire performance. So I think that's also an issue when you have so many fantastic actors around you. I think it doesn't help. Right, Volpus 89 for £10. Thank you very much. At its simplest level, it's about how boys without a decent dad become bad men. His dad is dead, his family exile him. Gotham dies before he can mold Barry. Pottsdorf is too cold, Chevalier too feckless. Yes, I think that's an obvious theme. It's not an original idea, brought up with the idea that he's trying to create the conditions of the family idyll with Brian and his absolute adoration of his son, as if trying to recreate the conditions which he never had with his father. I think that's an obvious interpretation you're supposed to come away with that he's the tragic element of Barry is that he's trying to find the family that he never really had. Um, even his relationship with his mother, who is quoted as saying that she exists devoted to his career and his advancement, is a complicated relationship and rather mercenary at times. And in terms of the agency, again, her character is afforded the agency of pursuit of peerage. It's her idea. Whereas in the book, again, Redmond not only pursues the peerage, but he also wins an election to be an MP. So there's a great sort of political career, which again mirrors the real life story of Stony Bowes. As for Pottsdorf, I mean, Pottsdorf is a much bigger character in the film than he is in the books. Pottsdorf's character is split over many different characters in the books. He's not the one responsible for capturing him. But you can't really expect Pottsdorf to have that same relationship that he had with Grogan, because Pottsdorf is his captor in many ways, and he's using him. He's using him due to his Irish ancestry to spy for the Prussian police agency. So obviously, Pottsdorf doesn't care about Barry so much. Again, he's interested in using him, which Grogan definitely didn't have that um, desire of Barry. But yes, it's trying to underline the tragedy, I guess. JBDC for $10, thank you. Also, always saw parallel with EWS, but as the most biological response of the fine family fortune group to the intruder. Sorry, I'm being completely stupid. EWS.
Eyes Wide Shut.
Oh yes, thank
Kubrick's
you.
final film. Yeah.
Would you agree with that statement? Because I haven't seen Eyes Wide Shut.
Oh, okay. No, I think there's something to that. I mean, so there's this equally well. There's a sinister line that kind of is detectable to some degree in Kubrick's films, but particularly in Barry Lyndon and Eyes Wide Shut. I mean, so I can't remember the name of the character. When he's pursuing the peerage, he goes with they go to visit someone, and I can't remember. So Lord Hallam is the man, but then Lord Wendover is his name, and so there's a scene where they go to visit Lord Wendover, and he says he's a gentleman of His Majesty's closet, and Wendover gives him, I don't remember word for word, but Wendover gives him this little thing, when I take someone under my wing, he's not the not the most virtuous or the least virtuous, but the best. The basically this whole sort of the slightly sinister implications of that. Yes, who are? I mean, what is he talking about there? I mean, it's a similar thing in Eyes Wide Shut. I mean, if you knew some of the people who were at this orgy, you wouldn't sleep so well at night. Is what one of the characters says to Tom Cruise's character. But then again, it's the idea that there is this sort of the group of, quote, the best people, the fine family fortune. All of these sort of cachets of power and influence that the outsider character in the form of Dr. Harford in Eyes Wide Shut, or in Barry Lyndon in this film, just have no access to. They try. I mean, even in Eyes Wide Shut, Tom Cruise's character, he ostensibly gains entrance to the inner sanctum, or to the kind of ritual at the center of sort of human power, and yet of course he's immediately detected as not belonging there. You don't and of course one of the women in the mask comes up and says, "You don't belong here, do you?" I don't know what you're doing, but you don't belong here. And similarly, of course, I think someone in the comments mentioned that when, of course, Barry stands before the king, George III, and called George III, it just doesn't even register. He's like, oh well, Barry Lyndon is going to raising a regiment to send to fight the rebels in America, and the king, of course, just immediately, well, yeah, but get another one and go with them. I mean, just immediately understands that, this is not someone he has any reason to talk to. So I think there's a relationship there between this idea of the outsider, the intruder, that sort of interests me. Sorry to go on so long.
No, it's very interesting. I haven't, I've seen most of his films, but I haven't seen EWS, so thank you. Again, there's only a limited point of comparison from my own sort of perception, so thanks. JBDC again, thinking outside sources distract you. You've made many good points. Check out the Leon Vitali movie Film Worker, but please never ask to read Stephen King. Well, that's my thing, I'm afraid. All of my reviews on this channel, the reason I review films is that I don't really see people review films this way, which is to look into their historical context and their historical veracity. That's why I'm very interested to Barry Lyndon. That's why a lot of people are very interested to Barry Lyndon. The whole notion that it represents this cultural depiction or romanticism associated with the 18th century and an era that's been completely lost, and the desire to have an authentic portrayal of it as much as we can. We've gone into the limitations of Stanley Kubrick. We've gone into the limitations when it comes to religion in particular, which I think inhibits someone from Kubrick, from really understanding, you can say, the conceptual realms that existed in the 18th century, even if they may appear completely hypocritical
Yeah.
in a figure like the Chevalier. They existed nevertheless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reminds me of one of my favorite Kubrick anecdotes is that during the making of The Shining, of course, which is based on a novel by Stephen King. Stephen King famously hates the Kubrick's version of The Shining, and that's a case where, of course, the film ends up far transcending the limitations of the source material. But Kubrick, I mean, obviously there was great time difference between living in England and living in America, but I don't think it entirely explains it. But apparently, at some point during the production, actually during this Kubrick writing of the script, he would constantly call Stephen King at like totally inopportune times and ask him these oblique questions and then hang up the phone. And so apparently one night at about 3 o'clock in the morning, King's time, the phone rang and he picked it up and it was Stanley Kubrick, and he said, "Stephen, do you believe in God?" And apparently it was sort of the last straw. But very interesting thinking about Kubrick, and as I said, the sort of noticeable lack of transcendence and the notable lack of God in so many of Kubrick's works. But of course, it was that there was a subtext there that obviously Kubrick was thinking about with The Shining. But I like the idea of that. Kubrick just calling up in the middle of the night and asking you if you believe in God.
I think in the case of, Stephen King has a notoriously bad reputation when it comes to appraising adaptations of his own work. Say for example, I think the other great Stephen King adaptation, of course, is going to be a very trite opinion, but The Shawshank Redemption, which again far exceeds its source material. But I I think that also comes across in the character of Runt, of the chaplain, because he doesn't really have a religious reason to be there in the film. His only reason there is to act as some sort of counter, effectively, to Redmond. He's the anti-Redmond, and he loves the Countess in a completely alternative way, and he's supposed to stand there as that juxtaposition. Um, the whole notion that he again is there to serve a spiritual role other than just using it essentially as a pretext to be close to her, I don't think would really be of any interest. I don't think it is, based on his interviews, any interest to Kubrick, who was far more interested in pursuing the love angle. As for this Leon Vitali film, the movie Film Worker, am I misreading that?
I don't know. I don't know it. I mean, it may indeed be something like that. I mean, Vitali, of course, was being the kind of closest professional relationship that Kubrick ever had. You know, Kubrick famously tended to sort of be very intensely associated with collaborators and then drop them, you know, and never really have anything to do with them again. But one of the few abiding working relationships. So I don't know if there may be a film. I mean, Vitaly, as I said, died a few years ago. So, but there may be. But I've not seen this, or I don't know anything about it.
Yes, this is the Umbrella Observer for $5. This is the super chat you were referring to earlier. The moment Barry meets King George and is told to raise a regiment and go with them too was his last chance to become a noble. Yeah, I think that scene is actually one of my favorite in the whole film because I'm not sure how he was able to depict it, but Ryan O'Neal seems smaller in that scene somehow, you know, as if
Hmm.
there's some sort of forced perspective going on. But George is huge by comparison to him. I have to rewatch that scene and see how they
Yeah.
do it. But you know, George is almost twice the size of him in that scene. And I think if ever there was like a visual representation simply based on the camera angle of, you know, the real thing and the imposter, and they're having no registration, you know, on the face, you know, completely being unconcerned by this, you know, this Irish rogue's, you know, doomed pursuit of a peerage. I think it was wonderfully represented without having to say anything more direct than
Hmm.
simply that, exhorting him to do more. JBDC for $5. Again, thank you. I think Kubrick deliberately chose blank central characters to have the movies reflect on them. Even excellent actors like Modine or Delia were made blank. Do you think that's
I don't think that's no. I don't think either of them. I mean, I don't think. I mean, Frank. I mean, um, yeah. I never remember the character's surname. Dave, played by Keir Dullea in 2001. I don't think he's blank at all. I mean, even though, of course, you know, that's another film famously that has very little dialogue. It's a very long film with almost no dialogue at all. With a few moments of it, most of which is spoken by the computer on the ship. But and Keir Dullea, of course, I mean, he's got moments, but again, most of his acting is done through his face and his eyes and his, you know, and his comportment in those scenes. But I don't think even with that minimal material, I don't think he's blank. I certainly don't think Matthew Modine is tall as a character or an actor otherwise, is quote blank in the way that that I just feel that Ryan O'Neal is. I mean, perhaps that's just me responding to Ryan O'Neal's character in an intuitive way, but I just, you know, that's the word that comes to me, and I don't feel it so much. I mean, I think the only other main character in Kubrick, which is sort of an equivalent blank, is Tom Cruise's character in Eyes Wide Shut. Um,
having not seen the film, that doesn't surprise me at all.
yeah, well, there are other sort of reasons for that, and it's the most it's the most similar in terms of casting a big name, you know, to play a very subtle role that may have been just outside of that actor's particular talents. I mean, Tom Cruise, you know, there's certain things that he does very well, but they're not what was required of that character. And Ryan O'Neal, I'm less familiar with as an actor, but you know, again, I think Kubrick was asking some very, very subtle things, and perhaps they just weren't the people to give it. But maybe that's what he wanted. I think Kubrick would not have proceeded if he hadn't been satisfied. I think he was certainly, by that point in his career and artistically his temperament, he would not have settled, really. So I
It's
assume that
interesting.
all of his decisions were that the decisions that he made were deliberate and not just because he out of necessity.
It's very interesting because I was going to ask your opinion on, you know, to what extent is he an actor's director in the sense that he allows actors freedom of interpretation when it comes to imbuing their role with something that the director didn't necessarily anticipate. Because I would say that I've gone over interpretation and adaptation, and the point again is to belabor the fact that the betrayal of the main character is almost segmented, and thereby it comes across as rather incongruous as a completed whole. If you are going to look at this film as very choppy and one sort of visually sort of impressive scene with a fantastic musical backdrop after another, it's because it seems that there is no consistent character which has been portrayed from beginning to end. And the issue is that the character in Thackeray is written a certain way, and Kubrick is trying to elicit a far more tragic element than is alluded to what he derisively refers to as the comedic aspects of Thackeray. And I believe in order to really translate that, it requires a very, very convincing and subtle performance. And I think, Kubrick may have intended that, but I don't think it comes across in O'Neill. So I'm
No.
I'm somewhat confused
Yeah.
as to how we got what we got.
Yeah. No, I would agree. I would agree with that. And Kubrick, of course, I mean, it depends on who you asked, because interestingly, I've seen, I mean, there's several interviews with various people. I mean, notably Shelley Duvall, herself also a kind of tragic figure, but notably played Wendy Torrance in The Shining. And also, I remember interviews done right after Kubrick's death with Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise, and all of them cry whenever they talk about Kubrick. I mean, for whatever, and of course, I mean Kubrick's treatment of Shelley Duvall, for instance, when there is a behind the scenes film of The Shining, unusually because of course Kubrick wouldn't allow most people on his sets, but it was his daughter Vivian Kubrick who filmed that, and so that's why this document exists. But he is absolutely brutal with Shelley Duvall throughout. I mean, really all their interactions were, him being extremely demanding and not particularly kind. And yet, of course, the reaction of these people is just absolute adoration. With Malcolm McDowell from Clockwork Orange, Kubrick worked very closely with him, and Malcolm McDowell, of course, unfortunately mistook this very intense professional relationship as being, genuine friendship and love. And of course, after the Clockwork Orange was finished, Kubrick basically just never had anything else to do with him. And Malcolm McDowell has talked in interviews about how heartbroken he was. That, of course, So it is interesting that Kubrick seems to have had a great emotional impact on his main actors, but he was certainly not someone to indulge any sort of. There was no ad-libbing, and just because Kubrick was famous for having very very large shooting ratios, in other words, he shot enormous amounts of film compared to how much film is ended up in the final product. He shot take after take after take. Famously, the scene in The Shining where um, Shelley Duvall backs up the stairs with the swing of the baseball bat was shot like 150 times. One of the highest numbers of takes in any motion picture. So it's not a situation that allows any kind of freedom once everything is put together. But interestingly, I mean, a lot of the actors who worked with Kubrick closely really really admired him. So.
Well, the legend around that is that in that scene with Shelley Duvall, she isn't acting anymore. She's simply
Yeah.
reacting to Stanley Kubrick.
Broken. I mean, absolutely. And of course, I mean, her appearance is extraordinary. And you could tell. I mean, she was a very sensitive woman, and I think Kubrick deliberately. I mean, and of course, you can just watch how he interacts with Jack Nicholson, and Jack, of course, being him, just snaps in and out of it. I mean, of course, given how extreme his character is, but I mean, there's a scene which actually Kubrick shot lying on the floor, holding the camera up, shooting Jack Nicholson from below, and it's when Jack is caught in the store cupboard, and he's telling his wife to go check out the Snowcat, which is the vehicle which would allow them to to escape because he sabotaged it. And then so he's like, go check it out. Ah! He's like laughing maniacally and whatever. And then in the behind the scenes, you see that he just sort of stands up and, and just shakes it off, Whereas I think someone like Shelley Duvall and other kind of more emotional performers, it wasn't something you could turn on and off. It was the result of, and the shoot was very long. I mean, the shoot for Barry Lyndon was 300 days, which is a long time for a motion picture production to go on. The shoot for The Shining indeed was similar, a very, very long shoot. So, and it's I mean, day after day after day, particularly if you're a lead, you work with such a perfectionist, it's certainly going to have an effect on you. And if you're not prepared for it, if you're not like Jack Nicholson, it can wear you down, literally. So,
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Steve, for bringing all your wonderful insights. And again, I couldn't really talk about this film, and given the visual language and all the association with all of the paintings and the 18th century vistas, I couldn't do it without inviting you. So thank you for coming along. As for stuff you've got going on, I'll let you sort of shell your own stuff. But I just want to recommend everyone to check out his channel. He and I have recently been talking about Stephen Sondheim, in particular Pacific Overtures, his sort of Bakamatsu era musical. So please check out that. It's a commentary, a live commentary to that musical. Also, he's done a wonderful series, an ongoing series on David Lynch's Twin Peaks: The Return, which I've been enjoying very much. I was thinking, because when David Lynch died, everyone was throwing their hat in the ring and doing stuff on David Lynch, and I thought about doing something. I thought I would have absolutely nothing of any interest or value to add compared to all the esteemed sort of peers I have around me doing such things. So thank you for that, Dee. But other than that, is there anything else you would like to tell the audience?
No, I mean, thank you for the very kind words. Yes, I noticed someone's, said it's good to hear Mr. D's voice again. It's always funny because people sort of act like I've been missing for so long, but I do, very late night, America time, certainly unapproachable for most people in Europe because it's, very early in the morning. But I do, several times a week, these rambling Twitter spaces where I talk to various people or just to myself, as been the case recently. So if you want, for some reason, more of me, you can certainly follow me on Twitter and listen to those. And as AM said, I do have excuse me. The dog is trying to have a word. No, I do have a YouTube channel, and I've been doing this ongoing series of about Twin Peaks Return. Thank you for mentioning that. And I was certainly going to mention that, yes, AM was gracious enough to appear on my channel, and we did wonderful two-part live review of Sondheim's Pacific Overtures, and AM's contributions to that discussion of the history and the form of the musical were absolutely invaluable. So thanks again for doing that. And people, fans of Apostolic Majesty should certainly check that out. Not for me, but certainly for him. And thank you once again. Always an absolute pleasure to talk to you and appear on your channel.
Well, thank you very much. Very kind words all round. Just to say, I've been asked to tell everyone that on the 28th of August, I will be speaking at the Skildings event, Foundations First. You can find out more about that if you follow me over on Twitter. Thank you again, Dee, very much for joining us. Thank you to the audience for listening and for sending a super chat. And good night.